The evening of September the 8th, 1943, found a powerful task force of Italian capital ships steaming into the Mediterranean. 3 battleships, 3 cruisers and 8 destroyers, a truly formidable concentration of naval power, had left their moorings at the Italian naval base at La Spezia. Leading the formation was the flagship Roma. A Littorio-class battleship, the 45,000-ton Roma was one of the most advanced big-gun capital ships in the world. She had a formidable main armament of 9 1943 model 50 caliber guns, which were amongst the best 15-inch guns operational anywhere. Roma was protected by a 13-inch armoured belt, and her 8 boilers, which produced over 128,000 horsepower, could propel the vessel to a speed of 30 knots. She was truly a state-of-the-art battleship, although her year-long service in the war had, thus far, been limited to the unglamorous role of floating anti-aircraft battery. But the night of the 8th of September was different. Roma and her task force were heading out to fight a major naval battle against a powerful Anglo-American fleet. Their mission was to intercept the Allied invasion force that was operating to the north of the Allied beachhead at Salerno. At least, that's what the Italians had told their German allies. But Admiral Bergamini had other orders. He was directed to take the remaining Italian warships at La Spezia and sail to Malta. There he would defect to the Allies. Things had changed in Italy. Stung by successive defeats in North Africa and Sicily, the political mood had shifted decisively against Mussolini. On the 25th of July, the Italian dictator had been deposed and arrested, ending 21 years of fascist rule. Although the new Prime Minister, Pietro Badoglio, professed continued fealty to, and alliance with, Nazi Germany, privately Italy was in negotiations to end the war. Called the Armistice of Cassibile, the agreement would end hostilities between the Kingdom of Italy and the Allies, facilitating an Italian change in sides. As part of the terms of the agreement, the remaining Italian capital ships were to sail to Malta and surrender. But before this subterfuge could be successfully completed, the Allies let the cat out of the bag. On September the 8th, they announced the Italian armistice on public radio at Algiers. The dramatic fall of Mussolini had already aroused the suspicion of the Germans. Clearly, the announcement of the armistice did not come as a shock in Berlin. Expecting Italian treachery, the Wehrmacht moved with its trademark efficiency to disarm the large Italian forces that were operational across Italy. The Italian military had no idea they were about to change sides, and thus most Italian units put up no resistance. However, Bergamini's task force had apparently escaped before they could be interned at La Spezia. But the Germans were not about to let a warship of that capability escape unharmed. In fact, they were about to unleash a weapon that would change naval warfare forever. As dawn broke on September the 9th, the Italian task force had altered course. Instead of sailing to Malta, Bergamini had decided to transfer his ships to Sardinia, where King Victor Emmanuel was setting up a new, pro-Western government. As the day progressed, lookouts detected a pair of aircraft shadowing the task force. At first, the Italians thought these were Allied bombers keeping track of their movements, and Bergamini ordered his men to hold fire. After some time simply orbiting at high altitude, the 2 aircraft dropped what appeared to be bombs. However, they were so high that the chance of these weapons actually posing a threat to the ships was minimal. As could be expected, these objects simply fell into the sea thousands of meters away from any Italian vessels. Perplexed by these incidents, the Italians simply continued on their course. At 3:33 in the afternoon, another pair of aircraft arrived overhead. This time, spotters identified them as Dornier Do-217 medium bombers. Both appeared to be carrying a single, large bomb under the starboard wing, between the fuselage and engine. Now realizing they were under attack, Bergamini ordered his vessels to conduct evasive maneuvers and engage the incoming aircraft, but they were so high that this fire was ineffective. At an altitude of 18,000 feet, the first bomber pulled into a 60-degree shallow dive, dropping its single bomb as it approached the fleet. As the Italian sailors watched, the bomb appeared to fly itself, following the battleship Italia as it conducted a series of evasive maneuvers. Narrowly missing the ship, the bomb struck the water just meters behind it, detonating and severely damaging its rudder. As the crew of Italia desperately tried to repair the damage, the second bomber made its attack run. This time, Roma was the target. The Dornier again made a shallow dive from 18,000 feet, keeping the bomber well above the effective reach of the anti-aircraft fire. As it made its attack run, the Doe 217 followed the weapon in, watching it as it approached its target. The crew of the Roma watched as the bomb tracked them as the ship turned violently, its 4 stubby wings visibly flying it towards the great ship. The weapon struck the vessel on the starboard side, just aft of amidships. It cleaved through the armoured deck, passing through the boiler rooms and hull, detonating beneath the keel. The impact of the weapon was truly devastating. With her boiler rooms heavily damaged, Roma's speed dropped to 12 knots, and most of her electrical power was out. She was a sitting duck for the second attack. At 3:52, a second weapon struck, this time detonating inside the forward engine room. The explosion caused a magazine detonation, blowing the number 2 turret clean off the ship and killing everyone on the bridge. The crippled Roma, now ablaze, began sinking by the bow. At 4:15, she was gone, taking Bergamini with her. Of Roma's 1,849 strong crew, 1,235 officers and men were killed. The mighty battleship Roma had been sunk by an entirely new class of weapon. Called Fritz X, the bomb was the first practical precision-guided munition. The weapon was essentially a 1,500 kilogram armor-piercing bomb which contained a 320 kilogram high-explosive warhead. Unlike typical naval bombs, Fritz X was equipped with wings, allowing it to glide to its target. It was guided by the Kell-Strasbourg radio link, which allowed an operator to manually steer the weapon as it made its descent. In order to provide guidance, the launch platform would follow the weapon in, allowing the crew to visually adjust its flight path. When employed properly, Fritz X was a devastatingly effective weapon. Just 2 were required to sink the mighty Roma, with a third weapon badly damaging Italia. In contrast, the Japanese battleship Musashi was struck by 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs before she sank, which does not include the dozens of weapons that missed. Although technically a glide bomb rather than a missile, the Fritz X was still the father of all anti-ship cruise missiles, a technology that would revolutionize naval warfare. Ever since the Battle of Plymouth in 1588, where the Spanish Armada was punished by the gunfire of the English galleons, artillery had been the primary arm of naval combat. For 400 years, warships would approach the enemy and hurl iron shot or high explosive at one another in a cascade of cannon fire. Although by 1945, the submarine, aircraft, torpedo, and air-dropped bomb had certainly changed naval warfare, artillery was still the primary arm of the surface warship. Indeed, it is often argued that it was the aircraft carrier that made the big gun capital ship obsolete. But this is untrue, or at least not completely true. By 1943, the aircraft carrier may have displaced the super dreadnought-style fast battleship as the primary component of great power battle lines, but major surface combatants still relied on artillery to kill one another. In fact, as the fate of the cruiser General Belgrano illustrated, large gun warships were still effective in the Falklands War, 60 years after practical aircraft carriers were fielded. More than the advent of naval air power generally, it is the anti-ship missile that has truly revolutionized naval warfare, relegating artillery to a secondary role. In point of fact, the primary way contemporary air power can be used to engage warships is through the employment of anti-ship cruise missiles. Even submarines use them. They are, undeniably, the defining feature of modern naval combat, at least when surface vessels are being engaged. Tactics, doctrine, defences, and even warship design are all founded upon effectively employing anti-ship cruise missiles and defending oneself from them. It is not hard to see why these weapons have effectively displaced naval artillery so effectively. In essence, an anti-ship cruise missile is simply a far superior delivery system for high explosive. One could consider it a self-propelled, self-guiding artillery shell. It's as if one took a 16-inch armor-piercing shell and gave it wings, propulsion, and a seeker, allowing it to not only fly much farther, but find a target and then guide itself to it. In the age of big gun capital ships, it may take dozens, if not hundreds, of rounds expended to score a single hit, something very difficult given the range at which the guns themselves were capable of engaging targets and the speed and maneuverability of surface vessels. But when equipped with a turbojet engine and radar seeker, unless the weapon malfunctions or something is done to stop it, a single anti-ship cruise missile will essentially always hit its target. More than any other major technological development in the 20th century, it is the development and proliferation of the anti-ship cruise missile which has so drastically changed warship design. In fact, understanding this weapon is absolutely foundational in any comprehensive understanding of contemporary naval warfare. One of these major, foundational changes in the character of naval warfare that was generated by the adoption and proliferation of anti-ship missiles was the newfound importance of the battle network. When one talks about networks in contemporary warfare, typically the digital network comes to mind. A computerized network composed of electronic sensors, data links, and computers that share digitized information. However, battle networks are far older than computers. In essence, a battle network is nothing more than a dispersed arrangement of target acquisition sensors, target localization sensors, command and control elements, weapons, platforms, and the electronic communications linking them all together. A World War II artillery battery is a good example of a battle network. An infantry element would request a fire mission, which would be relayed by radio to the battery or regiment headquarters. The battery then fires a small number of rounds which are surveyed by a forward observer. This fire is then corrected and a full fire mission is ordered. In this arrangement, the sensors, command and control, and weapons platforms are all dispersed and connected by radio or telephone, forming a network. Understanding the battle network and the interplay of battle network competitions is crucial in any wider understanding of the employment of the anti-ship cruise missile and, thus, how this technology has fundamentally changed the nature of naval combat. Although the technological landscape over which naval battle had been fought has changed dramatically, for the 400 years between the Spanish Armada and the great battleship duels of World War II, the fundamental tactical premise had remained the same. Naval artillery, unlike the anti-ship cruise missile, is generally a within visual range weapon system. This was as much the case at the Battle of Trafalgar as it was at the North Cape. Obviously, in any time period, simply finding ships in the vastness of the ocean is a significant challenge, and although pervasive sensors and space-based ocean surveillance systems have alleviated this problem somewhat, it is still a fundamental tactical challenge. Nevertheless, once an enemy task force has been located, in the missile age, the method of engagement is completely different. Let's use the Battle of the Denmark Strait as an example of a late artillery age battleship engagement. It's late May 1942. The German warships Prinz Eugen and Bismarck, the latter of which is the lead ship of the 50,000-ton Bismarck-class battleship, have left their forward operating base at Bergen and are steaming through the North Sea. Their objective is to break out into the North Atlantic and raid the sea lines of communication between the United Kingdom and North America, where a rich bounty of merchant shipping and convoys can be found. The Royal Navy is tasked with stopping them. However, once they left Norway, where the resistance was able to provide London with intelligence on their movements, the German warships vanished. The primary method by which all sides conducted wide-area ocean surveillance was by aircraft. These could, in theory, cover a large area, but each plane could only see a relatively small piece of ocean at a time, and were generally limited to visual reconnaissance, which both limited their intelligence footprint and was badly impeded by darkness or weather. Thus, and despite the vast size of the Royal Navy, they certainly lacked a comprehensive and pervasive view of the whole North Atlantic or North Sea. To mitigate this problem, the British decided to use geographical choke points. Even if Bismarck and Prinz Eugen could not be tracked from Norway, they would have to pass through the heavily patrolled areas around the Faroe Islands, just to the north of Scotland and the base of the mighty home fleet, Scapa Flow, or through the Denmark Strait, between Greenland and Iceland. In the most likely approach, the Denmark Strait, the British deployed a pair of county-class cruisers, Norfolk and Suffolk, the latter of which was equipped with radar, allowing it to maintain contact in the dark or adverse weather. When the German warships were detected by the cruisers, the two ships shadowed Bismarck at maximum radar range, providing London with an accurate location. Given the limitations of aerial reconnaissance, in order to keep track of the German fleet units and allow the operational maneuver of RN heavy forces, Suffolk had to keep Bismarck within radar range, roughly 10 nautical miles. The persistent track provided by Suffolk allowed for the battlecruiser Hood and battleship Prince of Wales to intercept the German raiders. Once battle was joined, the reliance upon off-board sensors was obviated. In all artillery-based naval combat, be it the Age of Sail or 1942, a battle network was not required for the employment of the warship's primary weapons. In other words, once the major fleet units had made contact with one another, each vessel did not need aid from any other platform or sensor in order to effectively engage the enemy. The target acquisition sensors, target localization sensors, command and control elements and weapons were all concentrated on the platform itself. As Hood, Prince of Wales, Bismarck and Prince Eugen approached one another, they relied on visual observers for target detection. In order to gain a firing solution, the primary sensor used were optical rangefinders. These devices, arranged on top of the main turrets and in other locations on the vessel, measured the difference in angle between two telescopes in order to triangulate the range to the target. Radar could also be used in this role. This range and bearing information was then fed into an analog fire control computer, which calculated the appropriate firing angle. Much like an artillery battery on land, observers would watch the fall of the shells and adjust fire, walking the salvos onto the target. When it worked, radar could effectively fill both roles, detecting the enemy vessel and providing highly accurate range information. At that point, capital ship artillery duels were often decided by the side that was able to land a crippling blow first. On the 24th of May, 1942, it was the Germans who did just that. As Hood and Prince of Wales approached their prey, and before Hood could reach the relative safety of a short-range engagement, where her comparatively thick armoured belt would offer much better protection, she was struck by a diving 15-inch shell. The impact of this round caused a fast burn in one of her secondary battery powder magazines. Within seconds, she had blown in half and sank beneath the icy waters of the North Atlantic. Thanks to the excellent German gunnery and a good deal of luck, Bismarck had defeated the Hood. Although the technology had changed dramatically, this process was fundamentally unchanged from the Age of Sail. In juxtaposition to artillery battles, missile combat is fought in a completely different fashion. The major defining feature of the anti-ship cruise missile is its range. The vast majority have a maximum engagement envelope that is well beyond the typical visual or radar horizon. The Harpoon, as an example, has an air-launched range of roughly 120 nautical miles, 5 to 10 times larger than a typical surface search radar horizon on a major surface combatant. Thus, for many missile engagements, both involving aircraft and surface ships, the launch platform cannot rely on its own onboard sensors for target acquisition or tracking. Short-range engagements are still possible using a ship's own radars, but if the actual range of the anti-ship cruise missile is to be leveraged, a launch platform must rely on a highly complex battle network. This not only means combat between surface ships can now occur at far greater distances, but actually engaging the enemy is now a highly complex process that requires a wider system. One way to think of a battle network is as a kill chain. In order to successfully engage an enemy ship with an anti-ship cruise missile, you must detect it, establish a track, meaning continually updated location and course information, classify it, ensuring it is what you think it is, and then maneuver your launch platforms into position. Only then can you engage it. One can think of the different platforms that form the battle network as serving specific functions within the kill chain, all of which are required to successfully employ the anti-ship cruise missile. To illustrate how battle networks are critical in long-range naval combat with missiles, let's use the legendary example from Red Storm Rising, the Dance of the Vampires. Although a fictional example, Tom Clancy's portrayal of this kind of missile engagement is exceptional and a great model with which to explore these highly technical and somewhat esoteric concepts. It's 1986, and NATO is in a full-blown conventional conflict with the Warsaw Pact. As part of Task Force 11, the USS Nimitz battle group is located several hundred miles to the south of Iceland, escorting USS Saipan and her Marine Expeditionary Unit as it transits the North Atlantic. Along with her is the French carrier Foch and their associated escorts. The battle depicted in Clancy's book clearly illustrates a wider Soviet anti-access area denial complex that was very real. The Soviet Union was fundamentally unable to compete with the Western powers for sea control. It simply lacked the economic resources to ever hope to build the kind of blue water navy that could feasibly sail out into the world's oceans and fight the USN for control of them. The need to maintain such massive land forces and the economic inferiority of the Soviets precluded that as a realistic possibility. Instead, Moscow built the Soviet Navy as a sea denial force, one that was optimized to destroy US aircraft carrier battle groups and interdict the transatlantic sea lines of communication, with the goal of denying US forces access to the European battlefields. They would seek to leverage geography in order to buy time for their armies in Europe. In essence, Moscow looked to asymmetrically fight US power projection capabilities through its large submarine and long-range attack aircraft fleet, both of which were built around the highly potent arsenal of Soviet anti-ship cruise missiles. In order to employ these highly dangerous weapons, the Soviets had constructed a complex battle network that covered the whole North Atlantic. The first element in this kill chain was the Soviet ocean surveillance system. As Nimitz and Foch steam east, 270 kilometers above them, a prying eye came into view, the USA Radar Ocean Reconnaissance Satellite, or RORSAT. A marvel of Soviet military technology, these satellites used a high-power radar to monitor shipping. The power requirements of the onboard radar were so large that nuclear energy was required, and thus each of the USA satellites utilized the Topaz miniaturized fission reactor. They were deployed in a polar orbit, meaning each satellite could provide a radar sweep of an area of ocean twice every 24 hours. With the Americans unable to escape the inevitable satellite pass, the presence of the Nimitz battle group was immediately revealed to Northern Fleet headquarters at Murmansk. However, this satellite information was not sufficient for a missile attack alone. Satellites are very capable wide-area surveillance systems, but they have limitations, the first of which is how intermittent their sensor coverage is. Satellites move really fast. Orbital velocity at low Earth orbit is about 8 kilometers per second. Thus, as quickly as the satellite comes, it is gone. This is a particular problem when engaging ships because they move. The Nimitz battle group was limited to a speed of 20 knots by the LHA Saipan, but even at this leisurely pace, every minute after the satellite pass, the formation was now in a different place, steaming in an unknown direction. As time passes between contacts, the potential area where the target ship could be grows exponentially. This is referred to as the area of uncertainty. After 1 hour steaming at 20 knots, this area is 1,256 square nautical miles. After just 2 hours, it is 5,000 nautical miles. It's a 4-hour flight from the Soviet air bases on the Kola Peninsula to the target location revealed by the Rorsat Pass, by which time the area of uncertainty is some 20,106 square nautical miles, an area larger than the US state of Maryland. This is the primary reason why satellites alone are generally not sufficient to provide a firing solution for anti-ship cruise missiles. They can only provide wide-area surveillance, detecting targets, but not the sustained tracking of enemy vessels. In order to keep track of the Nimitz battle group, the Soviets utilized a number of maritime patrol aircraft, the Bear Foxtrot. First flown in 1952, the propeller-driven Tupolev Tu-95 is one of the most successful strategic bombers in history. Given the NATO codename Bear, it is still in widespread service today with Russian aerospace forces and is expected to remain operational until at least 2040. Despite its age and very slow speed, the extreme range and payload of the Bear have kept the platform relevant for decades. It may well see a century of continuous service. The Bear was developed into a dedicated maritime patrol variant, the Tu-142 Bear Foxtrot, which was useful in both the maritime surveillance and anti-submarine warfare roles. It was essential in maintaining contact with the Nimitz battle group as it maneuvered. Its extreme range, over 8,000 nautical miles in total, allowed 10 Bears to prowl the North Atlantic. Once they received information that Nimitz was operating somewhere south of Iceland, they began searching for the American carrier, arranged in a 1,000-mile wide line. Although the large and slow Bear was no match for fleet defense fighters such as the F-14 Tomcat, if it could remain undetected, it could not be engaged. In order to keep hidden, the Soviet aircraft maintained radio silence and relied exclusively on passive sensors, specifically their electronic intelligence systems. As the formation moved into the target area, one detected a pair of radar emissions. Even though the battle group had all of its air search radars turned off, there were two E-2C Hawkeye early warning and control radar aircraft airborne. Within an hour, several bears were stalking the formation, remaining outside of radar detection range. As radar emissions will always be detectable at a range that is larger than its maximum detection footprint, by keeping their distance, the Soviet aircraft were able to keep contact with the formation whilst remaining undetected themselves. Although none of the ships were detected directly, their location and course was inferred by the position of the two Hawkeyes and the slow, eastward drift of their orbits. With this information gained, regular target updates were relayed to Northern Fleet Central Command at Murmansk. Behind the bears were two groups of anti-ship cruise missile-armed maritime strike aircraft. The first element was composed of 4 regiments of Tu-16 bombers, codenamed Badgers, some 80 in total. The subsonic Tu-16 were certainly vulnerable to the deadly F-14 Tomcat, and thus were armed with the long-range Kh-55 missile, codenamed AS-15 Kent. As they approached from the north, the slow and vulnerable Badgers launched their long-range Kent missiles from well beyond the E-2C's radar footprint. The large, subsonic and unstealthy Kent approached at 30,000 feet and 600 knots, flying straight towards the target area, allowing the Badgers to retreat to safety. They were followed by 6 standoff jammers. With 160 cruise missiles employing a typical high-altitude approach supported by 6 jammers, the radar screens on board the Hawkeyes were filled with what looked exactly like a Soviet maritime strike package, complete with electronic warfare support, and within minutes, 4 squadrons of Tomcats were vectored to intercept. 200 nautical miles to the south, 3 regiments of Tupolev Tu-22M backfires approached the formation. The backfire was the premier Soviet maritime strike aircraft, and it remains one of the most capable naval bombers operational today. Essentially a generational replacement for the Badger, the backfire addressed most of its primary weaknesses. Even when armed with several missiles, it was capable of maintaining a supersonic dash, allowing the bomber to rapidly reach its launch positions and retreat, a necessity given the capability of the USN's fleet defense fighters. With the Tomcats drawn away to the north, the battle group was only protected by Fox 8 F-8 Crusaders, which stood little chance of stopping 70 backfires. With the second package now detected by the Hawkeyes, a Bear Foxtrot illuminated the formation with its Uzpek-1A Big Bulge surface search radar. This finally gave the strike aircraft truly accurate track information, something required for accurate missile employment. As the backfire screamed in at Mach 1.5, they reached their launch positions, some 200 nautical miles to Nimitz's west. Under each of the wing pylons hung a Raduga KSR-5, NATO codename AS-6 Kingfish. Essentially a scaled-down version of the KH-22, AS-4 Kitchen, the Kingfish is a supersonic anti-ship cruise missile. As they left the bombers, the 4-ton missile was driven to a top speed of Mach 3.5 by a 2-stage solid-fueled rocket motor. This rocket burn both rapidly accelerated the missile and increased its altitude to 60,000 feet. In the head of the weapon was a radar seeker that scanned a cone of sea some 10 miles wide, and with an accurate fire solution provided by the Bear, most of the 140 missiles successfully acquired a target. With an average speed of 900 knots, or Mach 1.3, the missiles covered the 200 nautical mile distance in 13 minutes. When each Kingfish reached its target coordinates, it began a steep dive from 60,000 feet, reaching a terminal velocity of over Mach 3. Screaming through the barrage of defensive missile and gunfire, about 10 missiles strike their targets, slamming into the American vessels. Nimitz suffers 2 devastating blows. As the AS-6 slammed into the deck, its warhead detonated. 1,000 kilograms of high explosives formed into a shaped charge. Akin to a giant rocket-propelled grenade, the warhead formed an explosive penetrator, burning a hole into Nimitz's bowels. Within seconds, the mighty supercarrier was set ablaze. The LHA Saipan disintegrated when a Kingfish detonated her magazine, sending 2,500 souls to the bottom of the North Atlantic, and there was only a debris field where Foch used to be. Obviously, none of this actually happened, But Tom Clancy's fictional depiction of a modern anti-ship cruise missile battle is an excellent illustration with which to understand how modern naval battle is waged. It was, and still is, a highly plausible model. As we can see, the battle network is absolutely foundational in the employment of the anti-ship cruise missile. Every element in the Soviet kill chain is filled by a different platform, which are separated by hundreds of nautical miles and all linked together by radio communications. The RAWSAT served as the target acquisition sensor, first detecting the presence of the Nimitz battle group. Target localization and tracking was provided by the Bear Foxtrot maritime patrol aircraft, which was vectored into the target area by the satellite intelligence. This sustained tracking information was then supplemented by a long-range radar sweep, this time provided by a different Bear. The launch platforms themselves, the Tu-22Ms, never even had to use their own radars, but rather relied on a firing solution generated by off-board sensors, allowing the missiles to guide themselves to the target. The whole raid was commanded by both Northern Fleet Command at Murmansk and a raid commander in a dedicated command and control aircraft. This truly is a system of systems, a complex web of different platforms, weapons, sensors, and people linked together by electronic communications and dispersed over a large portion of the North Atlantic Ocean, an arrangement which has only been made more fundamental by the development of digital data links. The battle network truly is a foundational concept which is essential in understanding missile-based naval combat. Indeed, when two missile-armed naval forces are engaging one another, often the outcome will be determined not by the missiles themselves or the strength of the defenses, but who wins the battle network competition. If this system of systems can be effectively disrupted, then the kill chain can be broken, preventing the employment of even the most deadly and long-range anti-ship missiles. The development of the anti-ship missile has not only fundamentally changed naval tactics, it also had a revolutionary impact on warship design. During the artillery age, a warship's primary defenses were passive. To be sure, speed was always an important means of protecting oneself. In some sense, a battlecruiser's armor was her speed, as the ability to move quickly and change direction rapidly made achieving and maintaining an artillery firing solution more difficult, especially in the age of optical rangefinders and analog fire control computers. There were other more active means of defense, such as the laying of a smokescreen. Nonetheless, the primary means by which a warship protected itself from enemy guns was armor. USS Iowa was protected by an armored belt that was some 12 inches thick and sloped at 19 degrees. All of her vitals, such as magazines and engines, were housed in an armored citadel which was designed to be immune from 16-inch armor-piercing shells fired from a range of 18,000 yards. Her deck was protected by 3 layers of spaced armor, the most substantial of which was 6 inches in diameter. These armored layers were designed to detonate plunging shells and airdropped bombs before they reached the ship's internal spaces and stop any splinters. Each of her main battery gun turrets had an armored face, like a tank's mantlet, that was nearly 20 inches thick. The artillery-armed warship was a tank, designed to deal out devastating blows whilst absorbing enormous punishment without sinking. In her final death throes, Bismarck absorbed as many as 400 shells, ranging from 5 to 16 inches in caliber, and still she would not sink. In the end, despite the hellacious bombardment, her own crew had to finish her off with scuttling charges, which were helped by a number of torpedo hits. The Japanese battleship Yamato sustained 12 1,000-pound bomb and 7 torpedo impacts before finally sinking. That's how well protected a World War II battleship was. However, the anti-ship cruise missile rendered a purely passive defensive system essentially obsolete. The large warhead and extreme accuracy of anti-ship cruise missiles mean that the only way to defend oneself is to not be hit by them. The AS-6 Kingfish contained the same payload of high explosive as the airdrop bombs used by the US Navy dive bombers in World War II, but it took a force of some 300 aircraft to land those 11 bombs and 7 torpedoes on Yamato, equivalent to the entire air groups of 3 Essex-class fleet carriers. A single Slava-class cruiser is armed with 16 P-1000 Vulcan supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles, NATO codename SSN-12 Sandbox, each one of which deploys a 1-ton warhead. A single volley of these weapons would have done more damage to Yamato than the swarms of American dive and torpedo bombers, which launched from some 8 aircraft carriers in total, simply a function of the increased precision delivered by radar homing anti-ship cruise missiles. Barring a malfunction, unless something was done to stop them, all 16 would have probably found their target, their massive 1-ton shaped charged warheads blowing right through Yamato's 8.9 inches of deck armor. In essence, there was no amount of passive protection systems that could hope to protect a major warship from an anti-ship cruise missile armed foe. Clearly, warship design had to rely more heavily on active defenses if they were to survive in the missile age. Active defense systems had always been the primary form of defense from air attack, specifically anti-aircraft artillery, but armor was still a critical element of a warship's defenses in the 1940s. Neither would be sufficient to stop the anti-ship cruise missile alone. Nonetheless, the revolution in solid-state electronics that allowed for the development of the anti-ship missile also formed the foundation for its primary defense, the surface-to-air missile system. Just as the anti-ship cruise missile can be thought of as a self-powered, self-guided, armor-piercing artillery shell, so can the surface-to-air missile be thought of as a guided, maneuverable anti-aircraft shell. Even with proximity fuses and radar guidance, effectively engaging a fast-flying target with anti-aircraft guns required the expenditure of hundreds or thousands of shells, especially in the 1950s and 1960s. A radar-guided surface-to-air missile, on the other hand, not only had a far greater range, but a much higher probability of killing its target. In a very real way, defensive surface-to-air missile systems are a modern warship's armor. The SM-2 missile really is the Ticonderoga-class cruiser's armoured belt. The only passive protection these vessels possess are thin sections of Kevlar armour that are primarily designed to protect the ship's vitals from splinters and shrapnel. With the continued development of radars, missiles, command and control, and even radar-guided guns, major surface combatants soon developed a highly capable defensive complex designed to protect these vessels from the ever more potent anti-ship cruise missile threat. The modern warship utilizes a layered defensive complex that uses a combination of hard kill systems, including long and short-range missile systems and point defense guns, in addition to soft kill systems, such as decoys. Perhaps the paradigmatic example of a modern warship that is optimized to defend itself, and those vessels around it, from the anti-ship cruise missile is the Arleigh Burke-class destroyer. Arguably more of a cruiser, the Burke is probably the most successful modern destroyer design. It is an extremely heavily armed warship. The Flight 2A Arleigh Burke has a total of 96 vertical launch cells, composed of 12 8-cell Mark 41 vertical launch complexes. These vertical launch cells can deploy a number of surface-to-air missile systems, anti-ballistic missiles, land attack cruise missiles, and even the ASROC anti-submarine missile, which is really a rocket-delivered homing torpedo. The number of each kind of weapon can be changed depending on the mission, but for this example, let's allocate 80 cells to surface-to-air missiles. The Burke has 3 different surface-to-air missile systems that vary in range and size: the Standard Missile 6, or SM-6, SM-2, and Evolved Sea Sparrow Missile, or ESSM, all of which are designed to engage anti-ship cruise missiles. The SM-2 and SM-6 are variants of the same missile, the Standard Missile 2, which has been the mainstay of American anti-ship missile defenses for decades. The SM-2 is a semi-active radar homing missile, meaning it requires illumination from the Burke's fire control systems, specifically its AN SPG-62 illuminators. The modern SM-2 Block 3B has a dual-mode seeker, which supplements the semi-active radar homing element with an imaging infrared sensor similar to a Sidewinder. This enables the missile to counter advanced electronic countermeasures and allows for autonomous infrared guidance. The SM-2 Block 3B has a maximum speed in excess of Mach 3, a range of some 90 nautical miles, and a proximity-fused blast fragmentation warhead. The SM-6 is essentially an extended range variant of the SM-2, which is designed to be able to engage threats over the radar horizon. It achieves this by using an active seeker akin to an AMRAAM. Leveraging a technique called Naval Integrated Fire Control, Counter-Air, or Cooperative Engagement Capability, The SM-6 can be guided to targets that are well over the radar horizon by other platforms, such as airborne radar aircraft like the E-2D Advanced Hawkeye. It has a maximum range in excess of 130 nautical miles. The final missile system is the evolved Sea Sparrow. Essentially a short to medium range surface-to-air missile, the ESSM acts as both a point and area defense weapon. It is basically a miniature SM-2, and is small enough that 4 can be quad-packed into a single VLS cell. The semi-active radar homing ESSM has a much shorter range than the SM-2, greater than 27 nautical miles, but this is still well in excess of the radar horizon for low-flying targets, giving the smaller weapon a real area defense capability. The vessel could plausibly deploy some 128 missiles across its 80 available VLS cells, with 16 SM-6s, 48 SM-2s, and 64 ESSMs. Once you get past these layered missile defenses, the Burke is protected by point defense guns, the Phalanx Close-In Weapon System, or CIWS. The Phalanx is a radar-guided 20mm Vulcan Gatling gun that is specifically designed to shoot down high-speed targets at close range. A standalone system, the Phalanx is equipped with a dedicated Ku-band fire control radar complex, which includes search and fire control systems. The independent search radar, located in the iconic white radome, constantly scans the airspace around the ship looking for threatening radar contacts. If it detects an object that meets well-defined threat criteria, including speed, bearing, and direction of travel, the system orients the weapon towards the threat, handing off the track to the dedicated pulse Doppler monopulse tracking radar. This system is very precise with an extremely high resolution, although it has a narrow field of view. If the Phalanx determines that the radar contact is a threat to the ship, it will engage it with the 20mm Gatling gun. The Vulcan cannon fires at a rate of 3,000 rounds per minute. As the outgoing shells leave the gun, the radar tracks them and walks them onto the target. The weapon fires the Mark 244 Enhanced Lethality cartridge, which has a hardened tungsten penetrator, relying on kinetic energy transfer to destroy incoming missiles and other threats. The Phalanx truly is a standalone system, meaning it can detect, track, classify, and engage hostile airborne threats automatically and without input from the ship's other sensors. Thus, an Arleigh Burke has 4 layers of kinetic defenses which have to be defeated: the SM-6, SM-2, ESSM, and Phalanx. But that's not all. Finally, we have the soft kill techniques. Achieving a soft kill means defeating the incoming missile without actually destroying it. Chaff is a typical way of achieving a soft kill on a missile. By spreading small strips of aluminium foil in an airborne cloud, a chaff dispenser can generate a much larger radar return, confusing the missile seeker. These countermeasures are deployed via the Mark 36 SRBOC launcher. The primary soft kill system, however, is far more sophisticated, the Nulka decoy. Nulka utilizes hovering rocket technology to maintain a low altitude, flying away from the targeted vessel. Within the rocket is a sophisticated electronic warfare payload. Rather than just basic jamming or chaff, Nulka generates a high-fidelity electromagnetic signature of the ship. To an incoming missile, it looks as though there are now 2 ships, or 3 if more than one decoy is launched. As impressive as these hard and soft kill systems are, without accurate detection and track of incoming threats, they are unlikely to be effective. Indeed, when engaging anti-ship missiles of any kind, a highly capable air search and fire control radar is absolutely paramount. After all, you can't shoot what you can't see. The Arleigh Burke is equipped with the highly capable Spy-1DV passive electronically scanned array radar system. Although PESA radars have been technologically surpassed by active arrays, in terms of real-world capability, the Spy-1D is still one of the most capable naval radars operational anywhere. It is an immensely powerful system. Its peak power output is an eye-watering 4 to 6 megawatts. As USS Lake Erie demonstrated in 2008, Spy-1D can track satellites in low Earth orbit and exo-atmospheric ballistic missiles. Unlike older systems, and some newer ones like the European S-1850M, Spy-1D does not rotate to complete a scan. Rather, the beam is steered electronically by shifting phase elements within the radar. There are 4 radar faces, each one of which has a 90-degree field of view. What this means is the Spy-1D can complete a radar scan extremely quickly. This is critical if you are going to successfully engage small, low-flying, and fast-moving threats. The system as a whole can simultaneously track over 800 targets. Controlling this ensemble of missiles, guns, and electronic countermeasures is the first complete battle management system ever developed, Aegis. Combat data systems are essentially the central nervous system of a warship or submarine. They connect the vessel's weapons, sensors, systems, and people to form an integrated whole. In essence, Aegis fuses information from various onboard and offboard sensors and presents this to the crew as an integrated picture of the battle space. It can automatically evaluate and classify detected targets, surface, airborne, and subsurface, engaging them autonomously if required. In terms of air warfare and anti-ship missile defense, the Aegis weapon system is the heart of the wider combat system. The Aegis weapon system integrates the air search radar, Aegis display system, command and decision system, and weapon control system into one dedicated digital architecture. In essence, one computer system controls and integrates all of these elements. This allows the Burke to respond to a missile threat almost instantly. As opposed to having a human being examining a radar screen and classifying radar contacts, the computers automatically detect, track, and classify threats, displaying this information to the crew and, in the most extreme of circumstances, autonomously engaging it with the appropriate weapon system. As we can see, the Arleigh Burke possesses a truly formidable, layered defensive complex. Despite its age, given the weapons it deploys, its sensors, combat system and countermeasures, it remains the gold standard in anti-ship cruise missile defense and air warfare. Nonetheless, European and Chinese destroyers and cruisers deploy a comparable capability and are actually more technologically advanced in some areas. Both the British Type 45 Daring class destroyer and Chinese Type 52D, as an example, deploy a more advanced active electronically scanned array air search radar, and each have a comparable layered air defense system. The Type 52D destroyer and Type 55 class cruiser are armed with the HHQ-9 long-range surface-to-air missile, which is a navalized S-300 variant, the HQ-10 point defense missile system, and the Type 730 close-in weapon system. As we have seen in Ukraine, generally speaking, Russian systems are a little more dated, but Russian vessels still deploy a layered anti-ship missile defense system. What all this means is a single anti-ship cruise missile actually has a very small chance of successfully hitting a modern warship, especially when that ship is embedded in a wider task force such as a carrier strike group, which can provide offboard sensing and the massing of defensive fires. In fact, the probability of a kill from any one missile is very low for a single shot. Each defensive system has its own probability of either destroying or defeating the incoming missile, and, as these stack up, the individual missile's chances of successfully penetrating the defences dwindle. As an example, the Harpoon has, on average, a 4.9% chance of penetrating the defences of an Arleigh Burke that is operating without cooperative engagement capability, meaning it detects the missile at the radar horizon, if supported by its own offensive jamming and other soft kill techniques. However, if that same missile was engaged by the Arleigh Burke with over-the-horizon missile shots throughout its entire flight profile, such as the SM-6, its chances are just 0.2%. There are several methods by which the anti-ship missile can improve its probability of impacting the ship, and all rely upon degrading the target vessel's defensive kill chain. One of the most effective measures that can be employed by all anti-ship cruise missiles are their own soft kill techniques, which include jamming. Given their small radar cross-section, missiles are inherently difficult to engage by surface defensive systems, a challenge that is only multiplied when jamming is used to support them. For example, the E-3M-80 missile, otherwise known as the P-270 Mosquet, NATO codename SSN-22 Sunburn, may only have a 1% chance of survival if it is detected at the radar horizon. However, if we include soft kill techniques, simulations show that probability jump to 12.6%. Generally speaking, current generation anti-ship cruise missiles do not include their own electronic warfare packages, primarily because doing so requires a significant amount of space and weight, which will dramatically reduce warhead payload and/or range and kinematic performance. Nonetheless, supporting assets can certainly be used to provide a missile strike with their own soft kill support. These can include the use of standoff jammers, or, as seen in the Red Storm Rising example, the employment of decoys. Future anti-ship missiles, such as the Tomahawk Block 5A, may include features like a DFRM jammer, giving the weapon an organic soft kill capability and greatly increasing its probability of a kill, but these features are not currently fielded by any operational weapon. Time is key in the SAM versus ASCM contest. If the ship's defences are given a maximum amount of time to engage the incoming threat, they will be given multiple opportunities to shoot it down. Given the extreme accuracy of weapons such as the SM2 and Phalanx, which use features like dual mode seekers, each defensive shot has a very high chance of success. If the ship is given the time to fire multiple surface-to-air missiles at the threat, and then employ its close-in weapon systems and decoys, the probability of one of these systems defeating the missile rapidly approaches 100%. The key to successfully employing the anti-ship cruise missile is to put pressure on the kill chain as a whole. Basically, it takes time for the ship's defensive complex to detect the incoming threat, classify it, decide to act, and then employ its weapons. Even then, using its weapon systems takes some time. Yes, SM2 and Aegis are amazingly fast, but this whole process takes a number of seconds, and then the missile has to fly itself to the target. There are three primary ways the anti-ship missile can effectively put pressure on the ship's defensive kill chain, differing approaches that have come to define the Eastern and Western anti-ship cruise missile design philosophies. The first is to use the radar horizon. A massively powerful radar like the Spy-1DV may be able to detect a missile at a range of 200 nautical miles, but that range is dependent upon target altitude. No naval air search radar can see through the Earth's surface, and low-frequency over-the-horizon systems are not really applicable to warships. Thus, if you use a low-altitude flight profile, you can effectively limit the radar range to the radar horizon. For a missile flying at an altitude of 10 meters or 30 feet, and an antenna at a height of 20 meters, the radar horizon is reduced to just 17 nautical miles. At a high subsonic speed of 600 knots, it will take the missile just over 100 seconds to traverse that distance. The radar may well detect the missile at 10 times that range if it was flying at high altitude, depending upon its power output and resolution. The second primary method of defeating defensive systems is speed. Obviously, if your missile flies faster, it spends less time within the defensive missile and gun engagement envelope. This is why supersonic missiles are more dangerous. Not that they are necessarily harder to shoot down, but because they give you less opportunities to engage them. The third is radar cross-section management. In essence, if you can make your missile look smaller to a radar by reducing its frontal RCS, you can reduce the detection range. This is because of something called the radar equation, which tells us that radar detection range is essentially a function of power output, antenna gain, sensitivity, and the reflectivity of the object. If you reduce the RCS of the missile, you effectively make the radar less powerful. This reduces detection range and, therefore, the time the defensive complex has to react. But even when all of those advantages are leveraged by the missile, the probability of a kill is still quite low. If we take one of the most dangerous currently operational anti-ship cruise missiles, the PJ-10 BrahMos supersonic ASCM, and give it every advantage we can, such as adding soft kill support and preventing the target warship from engaging the weapon with over-the-horizon missile shots, modern simulations still only give it a 35% chance of making it through an Arleigh Burke's defences. This means a less formidable weapon, such as the Swedish RBS-15, will have more like a 5% chance under those same conditions. This realization that any one missile has a low chance of actually hitting a target leads to several significant tactical implications. The first is the simple fact that anti-ship missiles need to be fired in volleys. Mass is required to have any chance of scoring an effective hit on an enemy warship with an effective layered defensive system, at least one that is active, operational, and working properly. Obviously, any missile will have a higher probability of a kill if it is facing a less sophisticated or capable defensive complex. Based on probability alone, if one missile shot has a 5% chance of hitting its target, then 10 missiles will give you about a 40% chance. But there comes a point where the chance of scoring a hit will reach 100%, not because of how the probabilities have stacked, but because we have reached the point of saturation. The air warfare capability of all warships has finite limitations. It can only manage and engage a certain number of targets simultaneously. If that number is exceeded, it simply won't be able to shoot down the incoming missiles, and just like a sponge that has absorbed a maximum amount of water, the warship's capability has reached its limit. It simply cannot handle any additional fire. Thus, even with the oldest, most obsolete anti-ship cruise missiles, you will be able to penetrate a warship's defenses if you simply overwhelm them. The number required to achieve saturation is related to the probability of ASCM survival. A low, fast, and stealthy missile will require less to effectively saturate a defensive complex. This is one of the primary reasons why older ASCMs are still tactically viable. Although this seems to be a relatively simple way to engage a hostile naval formation, just launch an enormous volume of fire, in the real world this is actually quite difficult to achieve. A carrier strike group, for example, with multiple Aegis destroyers and cruisers, airborne early warning and control aircraft and fighters, all linked together to form a battle network through cooperative engagement capability, may require hundreds of missiles to reach a point of saturation. When you consider the fact that the carrier will be hunting hostile launch platforms, relying primarily on older, short-range anti-ship cruise missiles to engage highly defended naval formations presents many significant challenges. Like many areas of modern military technology, Western anti-ship missile development had its origins in the Second World War. The cruise missile itself had been pioneered by the Germans. The V-1 was the first operational cruise missile, although it lacked the guidance and precision to be utilized in a maritime context. The United States had a number of wartime cruise missile development programs, the most important of which was the JB-2. Essentially a straight-up copy of the V-1, the JB-2 had limited success, but it would provide the US military with extensive experience in cruise missile design and development. This led to a swath of post-war cruise missiles for both naval and air applications, including the 3,000-mile range Northrop Snark, the supersonic North American Navajo, and the Martin Matador. As ambitious and capable as many of these systems were by early 1950 standards, none had significant applications in an anti-shipping role. Simply guiding a missile to half a nautical mile of its target was a technological challenge, let alone the autonomous target acquisition and terminal guidance required for an anti-ship missile. This was also the heyday of the nuclear weapon, and thus the use of these missiles as nuclear delivery systems was absolutely paramount. Throughout the 1950s and early 1960s, old-fashioned carrier air power was still the primary means by which the US Navy surface forces aimed to sink ships. The 1970s witnessed a revolution in cruise missile technology, utterly transforming the large, inaccurate, and unreliable weapons of the 1960s. Propulsion, electronics, guidance, fuels, and materials improved dramatically. Perhaps the greatest improvement was in the area of computers and electronics. The size, weight, and power requirements of inertial navigation systems shrank, decreasing weight from about 130 kilograms in 1960 to just 13 a decade later. The total cruise missile guidance package, including computer, radar altimeter, and inertial systems, now measured 1 1/3 cubic feet and weighed about 50 kilos. These advances had made the modern anti-ship cruise missile a realistic possibility. Nonetheless, and despite the extensive Soviet development of the anti-ship cruise missile, the US Navy was lukewarm towards the weapon. It was, and still is, an organization and community dominated by naval aviators, and many viewed the naval attack aircraft as supreme. There was no real need, they argued, to invest in cruise missiles built around maritime strike with such a potent carrier force. It took the sinking of the Israeli destroyer Elliot, originally built as HMS Zealous, by 3 Soviet-made P-15 Tremit missiles, NATO codename SSN-2 Styx, to stimulate anti-ship cruise missile development in the United States. Despite the lethargy in the US military, McDonnell Douglas had already initiated a dedicated anti-ship cruise missile development program in 1965, and by 1967 they were well placed to meet the Navy's requirements. The USN originally wanted a 40 nautical mile ranged missile to carry a 250-pound conventional warhead that could use existing naval missile, Talos, Tata, and Terrier magazines, hoists, and launchers. To meet these demands, the Harpoon program was initiated in 1970. Harpoon is perhaps the foundational Western anti-ship cruise missile. Indeed, in terms of longevity, it is arguably the most successful ASCM ever developed. Some 50 years after the initiation of the Harpoon program, it still remains the most prolific Western anti-ship missile. In November 1970, the Defense Systems Acquisition Review Council approved the development of 2 versions of the missile, the air-launched AGM-84A and RGM-84A1 ship-launched, and by January 1972, the Navy had added submarines to the two other launch platforms. The Harpoon is a turbojet-powered cruise missile which flies at high subsonic speeds throughout its attack profile. Like virtually all Western anti-ship cruise missiles, the Harpoon uses altitude to complicate defensive missile interception. It is a sea-skimming missile, meaning it utilizes a very low altitude to evade shipboard defenses. This has many advantages, although perhaps the most important is it allows the missile to be both small and relatively lightweight. Harpoon is almost a 1,000-pound class weapon. The air-launched AGM-A41C weighs just 531 kilograms or 1,172 pounds, which greatly increases the weapon's tactical flexibility by allowing the employment of a diverse number of launch platforms. The missile is 151 inches or 3.9 meters long, and in its original version, the Harpoon had a range in excess of 60 nautical miles. In the nose of the weapon is a guidance and seeker section. It contains a dedicated computer, 3-axis attitude reference assembly, similar to an inertial navigation system, radar altimeter, and J-band radar seeker. The Harpoon can follow preset waypoints before beginning a radar search, and is capable of conducting complex terminal maneuvers automatically. The seeker itself has a number of search modes that are designed to operate in heavy electronic warfare environments. The weapon can receive targeting data from a wide variety of sources, which can be transmitted to the missile guidance section automatically or manually prior to launch. Behind the seeker section is the warhead. The Harpoon delivers a 500-pound blast fragmentation unitary high explosive warhead. This includes a delayed fuse which allows the weapon to penetrate a ship's hull before detonating. The back half of the missile is the sustainer and control section. The Harpoon is a jet-powered cruise missile. Under its belly is a cast aluminium ducted air intake, which feeds a Teledyne CAE J402 turbojet engine, which is fueled by JP-10 in a sealed tank. The missile uses 4 small wings to provide lift, and employs 4 control surfaces at its rear to maneuver. The J402 engine requires a minimum airspeed and altitude to function, and thus the surface-launched variants use a rocket booster to achieve this. The small booster section contains a solid propellant that provides over 12,000 pounds of thrust for an average burn duration of 2.9 seconds, after which time the section is jettisoned. From surface platforms, the missile is typically launched in a ballistic trajectory. The only major difference between the air and surface launch variants of the weapon is the booster. After the Harpoon is launched, either by using the booster section or dropped from an aircraft at altitude, the turbojet engine starts automatically. Using data from the inertial navigation system and radar altimeter, the missile flies at the optimum height for the prevailing sea state, keeping it low enough to remain under the radar horizon. The seeker is activated at a predetermined waypoint. After target acquisition, the weapon descends to sea-skimming altitude, often as low as 2 meters, using the radar altimeter to precisely measure its altitude. Finally, in the last moments before impact, the weapon can conduct a series of terminal maneuvers, such as a low-altitude pop-up. This flight profile is, generally speaking, common to most sea-skimming anti-ship cruise missiles. There are 2 primary reasons why Harpoon has been such a successful weapon over and above its lethality, leading to a service life of some 50 years. The first is its modularity. Because of how small and light the weapon is, it can be used on a large number of different platforms, from cruisers and destroyers to strategic bombers, fighters, and submarines. The missile comes in a standardized container that is designed to be mounted outdoors, which allows for easy integration on minor vessels such as corvettes and other warships that do not have a dedicated missile launcher, such as the Mark 13. These are typically mounted in complexes of 2 to 4, called the Mark 41 Guided Missile Launching System, which can be easily mounted directly on the deck of most warships. At its introduction, the weapon had a dedicated computer system, the Harpoon Shipboard Command and Launch Control System, which allows the user to pre-select navigation waypoints and target search areas. Because of how modular the system is, it can be easily used by land-based batteries. The Harpoon Coastal Defense System simply uses Grade B canisters and the Harpoon Shipboard Command and Launch Control System, which are both mounted in a truck. Finally, the Harpoon is small and light enough to be fired from a standard 21-inch torpedo tube. When used by a submarine, the weapon is installed in a buoyant container that is ejected from the submarine's torpedo tube, typically at periscope depth, which then breaches the surface. Once out of the water, the capsule's 4 sections separate and the solid rocket booster ignites, from which point the weapon acts exactly as though it had been launched by a surface ship. This flexibility and modularity is, generally speaking, a hallmark of American naval systems. It has allowed the humble Harpoon to fill such a vast number of different tasks, roles that would typically require completely different missiles in the Soviet Navy. The second major feature of the Harpoon which has led to such a long service life is its periodic upgrades. Much like the Standard Missile 2, which was first introduced in the late 1970s, the Harpoon has a long weapon development life cycle, adding new capabilities through a Block upgrade program. The Block 1D featured a larger fuel tank and improved software, including a re-attack capability if the missile was spoofed by chaff or decoys. In its ultimate iteration, Block 2, the Harpoon is a much improved weapon. The radar seeker now includes significant improvements to allow for better performance in heavy clutter environments, such as the littorals. One of the key improvements was the integration of a GPS receiver and inertial navigation system from the JDAM satellite-guided bomb. This allows the weapon to strike land targets and ships in port. A dedicated land attack variant, the SLAM, was also developed. With over 7,000 weapons produced and currently fielded by some 32 nations in total, the Harpoon is undeniably one of the most successful and influential anti-ship cruise missiles ever developed. It exemplifies the first generation of Western anti-ship cruise missiles, and although it is finally being replaced by first-tier military powers, we should expect the humble Harpoon to remain a viable and dangerous weapon for decades to come. There is, however, one other foundational Western sea skimming missile, the legendary Exocet. The weapons of Falklands War fame, the French Exocet is the other major Western, first-generation sea skimming anti-ship cruise missile. There are, of course, others, such as the Swedish RBS-15 and British Sea Eagle, but the Exocet and Harpoon are, by far, the most successful and influential. First developed in August 1968 by Aerospatiale and reaching operational status in 1975 with the French Navy as the MM-38, the Exocet follows the same fundamental design philosophy as the other Western first-generation ASCMs. It is a medium-weight weapon with a mass of 780 kilograms or 1,720 pounds, a length of 6 meters, and a 165 kilogram warhead, which can be canister-launched by surface ships and shore batteries. Submarine and aircraft-launched variants are also operational. Just like the Harpoon, Exocet is highly modular, with essentially the same missile filling a myriad of roles. The weapon is provided with a dedicated command and control complex that can be easily installed on a warship. The Vega Fire Direction Control System, developed by Thompson CSF, is used to detect, identify, and track the target vessel, as well as to guide the missile during the initial flight. Designed for small and medium displacement ships, it consists of a C-band Triton detection and target designation radar with a range of 45 kilometers, depending upon antenna height, and a Pollux fire control radar. In the nose of the MM-38 Exocet, there is a dedicated guidance and seeker section with an inertial navigation system, radar altimeter, and X-band active radar pulsed homing head. The assembly weighs some 30 kilograms. The seeker can detect a frigate-sized ship with an RCS of about 100 square meters at a range of up to 24 kilometers. Much like the Harpoon, the Exocet can follow predetermined waypoints, with multiple weapons attacking an enemy target from various angles simultaneously. Behind the seeker section is the blast fragmentation warhead. This can be programmed to penetrate the target, detonate on impact, or airburst. The warhead relies heavily on fragmentation to inflict damage, offsetting its relatively small high-explosive payload. It contains a large number of preformed tungsten fragments. The major difference between the Exocet and Harpoon is propulsion. The MM-38 and all other Exocet variants, apart from some of the MM-40 Block 3 systems, use a solid-fueled rocket motor rather than a turbojet. This makes the weapon much more simple mechanically and potentially more reliable, but it does reduce the effective range. When launched from a surface ship, submarine, or coastal defense battery, the Exocet utilizes two separate solid rocket sections. The first is a small booster section that is designed to accelerate the missile quickly and move it to a safe distance from the ship. This is referred to as the starting engine, which has a 2-second burn time before it is discarded. The main propulsion section, or marching engine, has a much longer burn time. For the MM-38, this is about 110 seconds, which gives the weapon an effective range of 42 kilometers or 22 nautical miles. This actually makes the weapon a within visual range missile, as two major warships should be able to detect one another at that range. The air-launched AM-39 redressed this lack of range by leveraging a rocket motor with a much longer burn time, some 220 seconds. This gives the weapon a maximum range of 70 kilometers or 37 nautical miles. This improved engine was also used in the upgraded MM-40 variant, which has the same range. The MM-40 is the most widely deployed Exocet. The MM-40 Block 3, or at least some variants of the Block 3, use a turbojet with 4 air intakes instead of a solid rocket, vastly increasing the missile's range to 180 kilometers or 100 nautical miles. The Block 3 was introduced in 2004. Very much the equal of the Harpoon Block 2, the new Exocet includes a GPS receiver and updated seeker, giving it both better performance in the littorals and a limited land attack capability. Despite the use of a solid rocket motor, the Exocet is a subsonic weapon. It reaches a maximum velocity of 0.9 Mach during its main rocket burn, after which it coasts towards its target. It uses 4 small wings to maintain lift. The Exocet's party piece is how low it flies. After an initial ballistic launch by the starter motor, the missile conducts its main rocket burn at an altitude of 10 to 15 meters as the seeker searches for the target. At a range of some 25 kilometers, the target vessel comes into the seeker's footprint, triggering a staged set of altitude reductions, first to 7 meters, and then to 2 to 3. If the sea state is calm enough, the Exocet will prosecute a terminal tack at just 1 meter above the surface of the water, that is 3 feet. Obviously, larger waves will require a higher altitude, but at that altitude an air search radar sitting 20 meters above the surface will detect the missile at just 12 nautical miles. The target would have 80 seconds to react. The Exocet was devastatingly effective in the Falklands. Indeed, along with the Sea Harrier, it was one of the iconic weapons of the war. In fact, this single missile alone almost decided the outcome of the conflict. The Royal Navy of the 1980s deployed some of the most modern naval air defense capability in the world. The Type 42 Sheffield-class guided missile destroyers specifically fielded the Sea Dart missile system and Type 996 three-dimensional air search radar. This weapon and sensor combination was highly capable in 1982. It had been specifically designed to counter the prolific Soviet supersonic anti-ship cruise missile threat. But not only was Exocet state-of-the-art at the time, British air defense systems had been designed to engage the high-altitude Soviet missiles they were likely to face in the open waters of the North Atlantic convoy routes. The small, sea-skimming Exocet proved to be a uniquely difficult challenge. On the 4th of May, Her Majesty's ships Sheffield and Glasgow were operating as radar pickets about 100 kilometers to the south of Port Stanley. The two ships were detected by an Argentine Lockheed SP-2H Neptune maritime patrol aircraft, which shadowed them throughout the morning. At 9:45, a pair of Super Etendard strike fighters departed Rio Grande, Tierra del Fuego. Each was armed with an AM-39 Exocet missile. The two fighters approached at low altitude, staying beneath the radar horizon, only popping up to conduct quick radar scans before retreating to the safety of the wave tops. At 11 o'clock, they detected Sheffield and Glasgow, entered the target coordinates, and launched the missiles. Despite the radar scans, Sheffield never detected the Etendards, which egressed at low altitude. This was because her main air search radar was offline due to a communications burst. Glasgow did, and informed Sheffield, but the air warfare officer decided not to act, as he believed their position was beyond Super Etendard range, and thus assumed they were other aircraft. Sheffield was not at general quarters when the attack was made. The two missiles were detected on radar. However, as no launch aircraft had been detected, the radar contact could not be classified. Incoming missile shots were finally confirmed visually, and the Sea Dart fire control system was activated, but just 5 seconds later, the Exocet impacted Sheffield. The missile hit amidships, about 2 meters above the waterline. The second hit the water 500 meters from her port beam. Luckily for the sailors aboard Sheffield, the warhead failed to detonate. Nonetheless, the still burning rocket motor, combined with the kinetic energy of the missile impact and damage it inflicted, started an uncontrollable fire. Sheffield eventually sank whilst under tow in heavy seas. 20 of her crew went down with the ship. On the 25th of May, the HMS Invincible battle group was operating to the north of the Falklands when it was attacked by another two-ship flight of super étendards. Utilizing the same low-altitude tactics, the pair of Argentine fighters detected the group and launched two AIM-39 Exocet missiles. The incoming weapons were detected by the escorting frigates, which had been the primary targets. Both conducted defensive maneuvers and launched chaff in response. This achieved a soft kill on both Exocets, with one hitting the water behind the escorts. The second, however, continued on searching for a target. It soon detected the 15,000-ton container ship Atlantic Conveyor, which was transporting fuel, ammunition, bulk stores and helicopters for the task force. The missile slammed into the ship's port side, its warhead detonating upon impact. Fire quickly engulfed Atlantic Conveyor, as their precious cargo of helicopters and other materiel soon caught ablaze. Following the fate of Sheffield, the burned-out hulk eventually sank whilst under tow. On the 12th of June, the destroyer HMS Glamorgan was steaming off the coast of East Falkland Island, where she was providing naval fire support to the Royal Marines as the Battle of the Two Sisters raged. As she steamed at 20 knots some 18 nautical miles offshore, an improvised Argentine shore battery tracked her. Desperate for more Exocet missiles, the Argentines had removed an MM-38 canister from the destroyer ARA Segui, cobbling together a makeshift coastal defense battery which was flown to the Falklands. 3 missiles were fired at Glamorgan. The first did not leave the canister. The second successfully launched but did not acquire the target. The third, however, did. Detecting the incoming missile, Glamorgan's captain initiated a rapid defensive maneuver, turning away from the weapon and presenting the smallest possible silhouette. This saved the destroyer from near certain destruction. The Exocet bounced along the deck, eventually detonating in the aircraft hangar. This killed 14 crew members and destroyed the helicopter, but did not impose critical damage. Within a week, Glamorgan was repaired. She re-entered Portsmouth on the 10th of July. The Falklands campaign had not only shown the Exocet to be an extremely dangerous weapon, but had demonstrated the value of sea-skimming missiles generally, validating the Western approach to anti-ship cruise missile design and employment. Despite their relatively slow speed, the use of low-altitude tactics had imposed critical pressure on the Royal Navy's OODA loop. As can be seen with the experience of Sheffield, with such a small amount of time between detection and impact, any confusion or hesitation within the command and control apparatus would inevitably lead to disaster. Despite the potency of her defensive weapons and radar, which should have allowed her to detect the incoming missiles and shoot down the Exocets, the threat materialized so rapidly that her command and control system more generally failed her. It just happened that at that critical moment, her main air search radar was offline. The air warfare officer happened to be having a coffee in the wardroom, and, when he was recalled to the ops room, assumed that the aircraft detected by Glasgow were not super étendards because he read a faulty intelligence report. The destroyer never even went to action stations. A very similar chain of events probably befell the Moskva, which was sunk by Ukrainian R-360 Neptune anti-ship cruise missiles, equivalent to a Harpoon, in April 2022. Indeed, the Royal Navy struggled to mitigate the threat posed by the Exocet, and had the Argentines had a greater stockpile, the amphibious operation may well have been untenable. Well before the Harpoon or Exocet programs were even conceived, the Soviets were charging ahead with anti-ship cruise missile development. Despite its immense land strength, the Soviet Union was absolutely an inferior naval power, especially when compared to the colossus that was the United States Navy. The USN emerged from the Second World War with the most formidable power projection capabilities the world had ever seen. It had 24 20,000-ton Essex-class fleet carriers, 14 of which were converted to allow for heavy fast jet operations with angled flight decks. These were supplemented by a line of carrier designs that were continually growing in size and capability. The first was the 3-ship Midway class, which displaced more than 40,000 tons. Although a World War II design, the Midway was larger than the currently operational French CVN Charles de Gaulle. But as the early 1950s ended, the US was poised to launch a whole new kind of aircraft carrier. The Kitty Hawk and Forest Oil classes were the first true supercarriers. Displacing some 80,000 tons at full load, each was 4 times as large as a World War II Essex. Their air group was composed of 90 heavy fast jets and helicopters. Protected by their supporting escorts, these vessels were awesome concentrations of naval firepower, allowing the United States to project power all over the globe. Given the simple economic and industrial realities confronting the Soviets, there was simply no way they were ever going to be able to develop, construct, and then deploy a commensurate amount of symmetric blue water capability. As is so often the case in military history, inferior naval powers will look to disruptive technology in order to redress aggregate naval inferiority. In the early 20th century, many smaller naval powers looked to the torpedo and torpedo boat to counter the great dreadnought battle lines of the major naval powers. Germany, in both world wars, used the submarine to apply asymmetric pressure on British areas of weakness through commerce raiding and sea line of communication interdiction. In the 21st century, China is doing the same thing through the development of anti-ship ballistic missiles and hypersonics. The Soviets looked to the anti-ship cruise missile to counter the immense power of the US Navy, specifically its carrier forces. Indeed, Soviet ASCM development has its roots as far back as the 1940s. It was September the 8th, 1947, when the Soviet Council of Ministers issued a requirement that the Soviet military should be armed with pilotless, anti-ship warplanes with a range of 100 kilometers. This was quite a technological challenge given the time period, and a special design bureau was created specifically to work on guided missiles. Remarkably, by 1951, Tupolev Design Bureau had developed a carrier aircraft, and the SB-1 Design Bureau had a prototype missile, allowing substantial tests to be conducted. The weapon resembled a small, pilotless MiG-15. It was powered by a Klimov RD-500K turbojet engine, which propelled the 3-ton missile to a top speed of 600 knots. It was given the designation KS-1 Comet. The weapon used a combination of inertial navigation and semi-active radar homing for terminal guidance. In essence, a series of gyroscopes would keep the weapon flying on a predetermined path. Then, as it approached the target vessel, it would be guided by a radar beam that was aimed by the launch aircraft. After some initial failures, a number of simulated attacks against the World War II cruiser Red Caucasus in the Sea of Azov achieved 8 hits out of 12 shots fired. Even without high explosive warheads, the kinetic energy of these large missiles moving at high subsonic velocity allowed the Comet to cleave right through the cruiser's armor, leaving large round holes in both sides. One shot punched through the heavily armored turret. Pleased with the results, the weapon was approved for service in 1953. As ingenious as the first generation of Soviet anti-ship cruise missiles were, they had limited tactical utility. When engaging lone surface ships, they certainly were a significant upgrade, as the launch aircraft would be able to stand off beyond the range of most anti-aircraft artillery and guide the missile onto its target. The high kinetic energy and large payload also made these weapons particularly effective if they were able to score a hit. But with the requirement that the launching aircraft, typically the large and vulnerable Tu-4 or Tu-16 heavy bomber, guide the bomb onto its target, attacking USN carrier forces wasn't really a practical proposition. These bombers were unable to stand off far enough to protect them from the American naval fighters that would surely swarm them as soon as they approached and provided terminal guidance. Still, given the time period, the Comet was a very successful weapon. It was much better than using unguided gravity bombs. The missile was used by Indonesia and Egypt, in addition to the Soviet Union. The success of the Comet quickly led to the development of much more capable systems that addressed its primary weaknesses. The need to manually guide the missile through semi-active radar homing was simply not a good technological solution. This problem was solved with the P-15 missile, NATO codename SSN-2 Styx. The P-15 is an absolutely foundational Eastern Bloc anti-ship cruise missile. Despite becoming operational in 1960, its variants are still in active service today with some 21 users, especially the modernised P-15M Tremit. The P-15 is a large weapon which is purely designed for surface launch, either by a warship or land-based battery. It is over 6 meters long and weighs in at a hefty 2.5 tons. The missile is cylindrical with short delta wings and control surfaces on the tail. Unlike the Comet, the P-15 uses a much more reliable liquid-fueled rocket engine. It has a large and capable 1,000-pound shaped-charged warhead. The biggest advantage of the Styx is the use of an active radar homing seeker. The seeker head is primitive and simple, but inexpensive. It utilizes a conical scanning radar. This allows the launch platform to simply fire and forget, meaning it can then employ defensive maneuver. In its original incarnation, the weapon had a range of 40 kilometers or 21 nautical miles, although the modernized P-15M Tremit achieved double those numbers. Housed in a large hangar, as opposed to a canister, the big missile was launched from a set of guide rails. It was propelled to cruise altitude by a solid rocket booster section. The P-15 used a low-altitude attack profile, but as early versions used a barometric altimeter, this was limited to 100 meters. The upgraded Tremit, which uses a radar altimeter, can fly much lower, down to an altitude of 25 meters, although 2.5 has been claimed. Infrared seeker heads were also developed for the weapon. The P-15 was designed to be a cheap and reliable missile that could be mass-produced and utilized on smaller vessels, such as frigates and corvettes. It was designed to give a corvette the offensive punch of a cruiser, at least over one salvo. Despite its large signature and reasonably primitive electronics, and thus poor resistance to electronic countermeasures, the Styx remains a viable weapon some 60 years after introduction. This is because of the metrics of anti-ship missile engagements, as noted previously, specifically the concept of saturation. Although the probability of a kill may be low, if you fire enough of these lumbering beasts, even the mighty Arleigh Burke can be overwhelmed. And against less well-equipped foes, which lack advanced anti-ship cruise missile defenses, the P-15 is still a deadly threat. It was licensed to both China and North Korea. In People's Liberation Army service, the P-15, NATO codename CSSC-2 Silkworm for the land-based HY-1, gave rise to a whole family of land, ship, and air-launched weapons that are collectively known as the Silkworm series in the West. These include the SY-1, HY-1, and HY-2, thousands of which have been manufactured. On the 21st of October 1967, the Israeli destroyer Elliot was hit by two P-15 missiles launched by Egyptian missile boats at Port Said. She sank with the loss of 57 men. Despite this early success, the primitive electronics of the P-15 family proved to be a key weakness during the Yom Kippur War. In one example, in the battles of Latakia and Baltim, tens of P-15s were launched at Israeli vessels, none of which hit their targets. All were soft-killed by chaff and electronic countermeasures. As an air-launched weapon, the Comet had proved to be a successful design for the time, but with ever-growing US naval aviation and more sophisticated missile defenses, it was clear that employing the weapon against US carriers was not a realistic possibility. By the late 1950s, the American flat tops would soon be filled with third-generation fleet defense fighters. The F-4 Phantom was a true generational leap over the aircraft it replaced. The fighter was theoretically capable of Mach 2 and had a very significant internal fuel volume. But more importantly, it was equipped with a highly capable fire control radar, the X-band AN/APG-72, which had an instrumented range of 200 nautical miles, and the beyond visual range AIM-7 Sparrow missile, the later versions of which could engage targets at 38 nautical miles. When supported by airborne radar aircraft, the F-4 would be able to reliably intercept Soviet bombers several hundred nautical miles from the carrier, well beyond the reach of the currently fielded Comet missiles, which had to be terminally guided. In order to meet this generational improvement, the Soviets decided to field a new generation of maritime strike systems themselves, fielding new missiles and aircraft. The next generation of Soviet air-launched anti-ship missile would be as ambitious a leap as the F-4 Phantom had been in fleet defense. The new weapon would have a massive range, an active radar seeker, and, critically, would be supersonic. This would allow the weapon to be launched from such a long range that fleet defense fighters would struggle to intercept the launch platforms, and in order to increase the survivability from surface-to-air missile defenses, it would have a top speed in excess of Mach 4. Called the KH-22, NATO designation AS-4 Kitchen, the missile being designed by Raduga was, for all intents and purposes, a superweapon. But in order to achieve such eye-watering performance, size and weight constraints had to be essentially abandoned. The new weapon was absolutely massive. It is some 11.5 meters or 30 feet long and weighs nearly 6 tons. It delivers a 1-ton shaped charge warhead. To provide lift, It uses a similar aerodynamic layout to the Styx missile, with a pair of small delta wings and 3 control surfaces at the rear. The KH-22 uses a pair of liquid-fueled rockets to accelerate the weapon and gain altitude. It can be used in both a high and medium altitude flight profile. When using the high profile, the missile climbs to an altitude of 90,000 feet and cruises at high speed. Once it approaches the predetermined target area, it conducts a steep dive, reaching a peak velocity of Mach 4.6. In low altitude mode, the weapon only climbs to 40,000 feet and then makes a shallow 30-degree dive at Mach 3.5, maintaining a lower peak velocity but greater speed throughout its flight profile. As the Kitchen dives, its active radar seeker scans the sea below for target ships. Despite its large signature and high-altitude flight profile, the sheer speed of the Kitchen severely complicates naval air defences. Even if the incoming missile volley was detected at 100 nautical miles, the carrier strike group would only have 160 seconds to shoot them down. The Tu-16 Badger was, and still is, a useful and dependable jet bomber. It is still in widespread service with the PLAAF as the H-6, but its slow speed specifically made it vulnerable to fighters such as the F-4. Although certainly not altogether obsolete, more capable maritime strike platforms were clearly required. Additionally, the new KH-22 missile was so large that the Badger could not employ it effectively. To redress this defect, the Soviets developed the supersonic Tu-22 Blinder. The Blinder was, on paper, a much better missile bomber than the Badger, with a supersonic speed and 3 tons of greater payload, enough to actually employ the KH-22. But the Blinder was a failure of a bomber. It suffered from poor serviceability, bad flying characteristics, a high accident rate, and skin heating at supersonic speeds. Even as it was being introduced, it became clear to both those in the Tupolev Design Bureau and the military that a replacement supersonic maritime strike aircraft was required immediately. This unnerved the political class, who were unsure of the requirement to spend more on developing a new aircraft when the Tu-22 was only just entering service. Much like the FA-18EF Super Hornet, to allay these fears, the new platform was designated as merely an upgrade to the Tu-22. Thus, the new bomber was called the Tu-22M, as opposed to the Tu-26. It is better known in the West by its NATO codename, Backfire. The Backfire is, arguably, the most capable dedicated maritime strike aircraft ever developed. It is still the mainstay of Russia's strategic bomber fleet. The combination of long range, large payload, and high supersonic dash make the Backfire an exceptional missile carrier. Its ability to race to missile launch positions, fire its weapons, and retreat at supersonic speed make it a very difficult aircraft to stop. Depending on the range, the Tu-22M can deploy 3 KH-22 missiles, compared to the Blinder's 1. This not only means the Tu-22M is more survivable, but more lethal. As we saw in Tom Clancy's iconic battle scene, a 3-regiment attack of 72 Backfires can volley fire 216 KH-22s, certainly enough to pose a saturation threat to even the most heavily defended task forces. To make a minor correction to the Dance of the Vampires battle scene, the Raduga KSR-5 AS-6 Kingfish missile was not really intended for use on the Tu-22M. It was a scaled-down, smaller and lighter KH-22 that used a solid rocket motor, allowing the Tu-16 Badger to employ a missile with inferior, but comparable, capability. However, this was probably not known to Clancy at the time, who may well have supposed that it was a more modern and more capable weapon. The combination of the Tu-22M and AS-4 posed such a significant threat to US carrier forces that it drove the development of the legendary F-14 Tomcat and its iconic primary weapon, the AIM-54 Phoenix. In fact, as is typical throughout military history, when you have an offense-defense contest, a generational leap on one side stimulates a comparable response from the other. Throughout the 1970s and early 1980s, the USN deployed a series of new capabilities that were specifically designed to counter the Soviet supersonic anti-ship cruise missile threat. Guided by the E-2C Hawkeye, individual F-14s could now engage up to 6 targets simultaneously at a range of 100 nautical miles, a capability that scaled dramatically when multiple squadrons were deployed. This engagement was called the Outer Air Battle, and it was a fight the USN had never been more well prepared to wage. Infield defense had been revolutionized by the Aegis-equipped warships, especially the Ticonderoga-class cruisers and Arleigh Burke destroyers. Indeed, by the late 1970s, even American frigates were equipped with long-range surface-to-air missiles. The Soviets needed more capable weapons to penetrate these improved defenses, especially for their major surface combatants and submarines. The Soviets had utilized two of the primary means of penetrating naval air defenses: speed and low altitude. But what if a missile could combine the virtues of both? How much harder would a missile be to intercept if it was able to hide beneath the radar horizon like an Exocet, but still achieve supersonic velocity like a kitchen? If such a weapon could fly twice as fast as a sea skimmer, enemy reaction time would be cut in half. But this is easier said than done, especially if you want to launch such a weapon from a surface platform. When facing a carrier, you have to stand off. If you approach to 100 nautical miles or less, your chances of surviving are slim. Thus, you can't just use a large liquid or solid fueled rocket. Plus, your precision-guided munition with its delicate electronics has to be protected from the immense surface heating imposed by low-altitude supersonic flight. Therefore, the new weapon had to have a very long range, autonomous targeting, and the ability to fly at supersonic speed and very low altitude simultaneously. Despite these daunting technical challenges, work on the new weapon began in 1969 at the NPO Design Bureau. However, it was some 10 years later that full-scale testing of the weapon was able to be conducted, and by 1983, the new system was declared operational. The P-700 Granite missile, NATO designation SSN-19 Shipwreck, is an immensely impressive weapon. It has a range of around 600 kilometers or 320 nautical miles. Obviously, this is far beyond the sensor footprint of any theoretical launch platform, which means the weapon is wholly dependent upon the Soviet ocean surveillance system and its accompanying battle network for targeting data. The Shipwreck has a maximum speed of Mach 2.5 at high altitude, but can sustain Mach 1.5 at the wavetop level. It is claimed that the weapon has an advanced autonomous targeting capability. When volley fired, a number of missiles share information via a dedicated data link, forming a network. Autonomously, one weapon flies at higher altitude, increasing its radar footprint, or at least conducts periodic pop-up maneuvers, transmitting targeting data to the other weapons which remain low. If the spotter weapon is destroyed, another will take its place. The network as a whole can be programmed to swarm a single high-value target, such as a carrier, or target individual vessels. With a terminal attack profile of 2.5 meters altitude and a speed of 1,000 knots, defensive missiles would have just 40 seconds to engage the incoming shipwrecks, placing enormous pressure on their OODA loop. Finally, with such a high terminal speed, 20mm close-in weapon systems, such as the Phalanx, will struggle to successfully stop the missile. They may be able to accurately shoot it, but with such immense kinetic energy, even a successful intercept will not prevent the missile debris from impacting the ship. The warhead contains some 750 kilograms of high explosive. A 500 kiloton nuclear payload is also available. Soviet surface action groups and individual submarines would conduct massed, stand-off shipwreck strikes, relying upon the wider battle network and centralized command and control to provide targeting data, firing coordinated volleys at carrier battle groups that had been located and fixed by the wider ocean surveillance system. It truly was a fearsome capability. This all sounds amazing, like some perfect Soviet Wunderwaffe, and certainly the third generation of supersonic, sea-skimming missiles are extremely capable weapons, but there are some downsides. In order to meet the range, altitude and speed requirements, the Shipwreck has to use an air-breathing engine. The P-700 uses a turbojet, although given the weapon's frontline status, reliable open-source information on its design and thrust are hard to come by. The air intake resembles the front of a MiG-21, with the incoming airflow ducted around the radar seeker itself. In order to fly that fast for that far, the Shipwreck needs a large engine and large internal fuel volume. Additionally, in order to ensure a kill on US capital ships, it needs a heavy warhead. These design requirements together conspire to make the P-700 a truly massive missile. Including its solid rocket booster, which is required to accelerate the weapon to operating speed, It stands some 10 meters tall. At launch, the whole assembly weighs over 7 tons. To put that into perspective, the shipwreck is longer than the UGM-27 Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missile. It weighs nearly half as much. This severely complicates delivery, restricting the platforms that can employ the weapon to Soviet capital ships. This is one of the primary reasons why the Soviets developed such large surface combatants, like the Kirov-class cruiser, which is classified as a battlecruiser in the West. The Kirov is a modern-day battleship. It displaces nearly 30,000 tons at full load, equivalent to an Iron Duke-class dreadnought. The largest major surface combatants in Western navies, such as the Ticonderoga-class cruiser, typically displace about 10,000 tons, 1/3 as much as Kirov. The reason why the Soviets built such a massive warship was simply because it was designed around these massive weapons. The Kirov has VLS space for some 20 P-700 missiles. This requirement, plus the need for formidable air defenses in order to protect it from USN carrier air attacks, is the reason why the ship is so large. The same stands for submarines. The massive Oscar-class SSGN was essentially built around the requirement to employ this weapon. This colossal nuclear submarine is some 155 meters long and displaces 19,000 tons when submerged. They are roughly the same size as an Ohio-class SSBN, which deploys the Trident D5 submarine-launched ballistic missile. In order to employ the shipwreck missile, you essentially have to build an SSBN. The Oscar class contains 24 of these weapons. In all, only 3 Soviet platforms were able to employ the Granite, the Kirov, Oscar, and Kuznetsov classes. Many of the problems with the shipwreck were rectified by the next evolution of the P-700 design, the P-800 Onyx. The Onyx is known by the name Yakhont on the export market. Its NATO designation is SSN-26 Strobel. An evolutionary successor to the shipwreck, work began on the Onyx almost as soon as its predecessor became operational. However, as with many late Soviet military systems which became current generation Russian weapons, all work on the Onyx ceased with the collapse of the Soviet Union. Despite 8 years of development from 1983 to 1991, the weapon would only finally be fielded in 2002. Onyx possesses most of the shipwreck's capability whilst providing greater flexibility and speed, all in a weapon that weighs only 3 tons. The missile is powered by a kerosene-fueled ramjet, rather than a turbojet, which allows it to reach speeds in excess of Mach 4, but Mach 2 is more typical in low-altitude flight. This is light enough that an air-launched variant was developed, which is a svelte 2,550 kilograms. Although the missile is 9 meters in length, it is still small and light enough to be employed by tactical fighters, such as the Flanker family, not to mention frigates, destroyers, and more typical-sized submarines. This gives the Onyx the kind of flexibility provided by Western missiles such as Harpoon. It even has a mobile coastal defense battery called the Bastion P. With a range of 300 kilometers, the Bastion is a highly capable anti-access area denial weapon, especially when employed in the constrained waters of the Baltic. Onyx also has a land attack capability. The only major disadvantage in comparison to the shipwreck is range. Utilizing a high-altitude cruise and low-altitude terminal attack profile, it can strike targets at 300 kilometers or 161 nautical miles, although this is reduced to 120 kilometers if it remains low from launch. It delivers a much more typical 500-pound high-explosive warhead. Although the Russians still deploy a vast number of different weapons in this class, Onyx is the basis for Russia's modern anti-ship cruise missile capability. The major warships it has actually built since the fall of the Soviet Union, such as the Admiral Gorskov frigate, are equipped with the Onyx. It is a highly effective weapon, and certainly remains one of the most capable anti-ship cruise missiles currently operational. Interestingly enough, the apogee of the shipwreck family tree was not seen in Russia, but India. In a joint venture between India's Defence Research and Development Organisation and NPO Mashinoy-Stroyania, a new missile design was developed to meet the Indian military's requirements. Called BrahMos, a portmanteau formed by the names of 2 rivers, the Brahmaputra and Moskva, the new weapon is an evolution of the Onyx missile system. BrahMos contains the propulsion section and basic design of the Onyx, but includes a new warhead and electronics package developed in India. It is, generally speaking, more capable than its Russian counterpart, though certainly comparable. Much like the Onyx, BrahMos can be employed by surface ships, shore batteries, and aircraft. It has been integrated with the Su-30 MKI. The new missile is similar in dimensions to its Russian predecessor. The ground-launched variant is 8.2 meters long and weighs 3,000 kilograms. At 2,200 kilograms, the air-launched BrahMos is significantly lighter and a touch smaller. It delivers a 200 kilogram warhead, as opposed to 300 for the surface-launched variants. BrahMos includes several significant upgrades over the baseline Onyx. It has a longer range, with some variants and flight profiles allowing for a maximum engagement envelope of 500 kilometers or 270 nautical miles. A submarine-launched variant is under development. It also includes an inertial navigation system that is updated by global positioning system data, significantly increasing its land attack capability. It has been claimed that signature reduction measures have been leveraged to reduce the missile's radar signature, but given the basic design of the airframe, the amount of RCS reduction achieved is probably minimal. Like all Eastern Bloc supersonic sea skimmers, BrahMos will have a very large signature, both in the electromagnetic and infrared spectrums. Nonetheless, the combination of its range, speed, responsiveness, and low-altitude attack profile make the BrahMos an exceptionally dangerous weapon. It is currently fielded by the Indian military, and in 2022 the Philippines has signed an agreement to purchase the weapon. The Russians are not the only Eastern Bloc player in the supersonic sea-skimming ASCM game. As has certainly been the case in virtually all areas of military technology, China has emerged from Russia's shadow to become a leader in anti-ship cruise missile development. As can be seen with the adoption and development of the Silkworm series, the PLA relied heavily on Soviet research and development, technological designs, and doctrine throughout the 20th century. Even after the Sino-Soviet split of the 1960s, the PLA was still dominated by weapons of Soviet origin. Indeed, as can be seen by the purchase of the Su-35BM, China remains a significant destination for Russian weapons. Nonetheless, over the last 15 years, China's wider military-industrial complex has moved beyond simply producing licensed or reverse-engineered Soviet platforms to the development of real, indigenous military hardware, some of which is certainly globally competitive. This is certainly the case in the area of anti-ship cruise missiles. That is not to say that the PLA does not still rely heavily on Soviet and Russian ASCMs. In fact, it currently fields a large number of Russian systems, including the P-270 Moskit, or SSN-22 Sunburn, and the 3M-54E Club, NATO designation SSN-27B Sizzler. Despite the widespread use of Russian or Soviet missiles, the PLA has fielded a family of increasingly capable ASCMs. The first is the subsonic YJ-83, NATO designation CSSN-8 Sakhard. Essentially the Chinese Harpoon, the YJ-83 is a 2,000-pound class turbojet-powered, subsonic, active radar-guided sea-skimming missile. It can be launched from surface vessels as small as corvettes and destroyers, and tactical fighters such as the J-15. The weapon has a cruising speed of 600 knots and a range of around 100 nautical miles. It utilizes a low-altitude attack profile of between 5 and 7 meters. Most of the PLAN's older destroyers have been retrofitted with the YJ-83, giving them a comparable capability to their Western counterparts. A submarine-launched variant, the YJ-82, has also been deployed on the Han, Shang, Song, and Yuan class attack submarines. Although other systems may generate more interest, the humble YJ-83 remains the backbone of the PLAN's ASCM arsenal. The PLA has also fielded a number of supersonic ASCMs over the last decade. The first is the YJ-12. Essentially a larger KH-31 derivative, the air and surface launched YJ-12 utilizes a ramjet to sustain terminal attack speeds of between Mach 2 and Mach 4. It has a range of between 240 to 400 kilometers, depending on the speed, launch altitude, and flight profile selected. It also uses an active radar seeker. The weapon has been developed into a land-launched variant, the YJ-12B. The Soviet design heritage can clearly be seen in the YJ-12. It is a Soviet supersonic anti-ship cruise missile with Chinese characteristics. This is also true of the more capable YJ-18. Although it uses the same layout and attack profile as the Russian Club, and looks very similar, it probably isn't a straight-up copy. The weapon has been under development by the China Aerospace Science and Industry Corporation, 3rd Academy, since the late 1990s. It became operational in 2015. Just like the Russian 3M-54E, the YJ-18 is a multi-stage weapon, combining a subsonic cruise with a supersonic terminal dash. This gives it the advantages of both a supersonic and subsonic weapon, improving its range and reducing its weight while still applying severe pressure to the target OODA loop. It achieves this by having multiple stages. When fired by a surface warship or submarine, a solid rocket booster accelerates the 8-meter long missile up to cruise velocity and altitude. Once there, the booster section is ejected and a pair of wings are deployed, allowing the turbojet motor to spool up. The YJ-18 uses the efficient turbojet to cruise to the target location, relying on an inertial navigation system updated with Beidou satellite navigation information. Once at the terminal phase, the sustainer section is jettisoned and a solid rocket accelerates the warhead and seeker to Mach 3. The weapon is also guided by an active radar seeker. This multi-stage configuration gives the missile a maximum range of 500 kilometers, at least for some variants. Indeed, it's not just in the design of their weapons and platforms that the PLA is emulating, and perhaps even surpassing, the mighty Soviet Union. Just as the Soviets had developed a large anti-access area denial complex designed to interdict the North Atlantic, complete with Rorsats, Tu-22M backfire bombers and Kirov-class battlecruisers, so are the Chinese building their own A2AD complex in the Western Pacific. In fact, China's vast battle network comprised of supersonic anti-ship cruise missiles, satellites, maritime patrol aircraft, submarines, bombers, destroyers, and drones is not only modelled on its Soviet predecessor, many of the systems and platforms utilised to achieve it are actually of Soviet origin. For example, the early elements of the PLA's Yaogan satellite constellation were literally based on the Soviet USA Rorsat. Just as the Soviets aimed to keep USN battle forces out of the North Atlantic, so does the PLA aim to bar them from the Western Pacific. Essentially, they are using exactly the same means to do so, albeit with high-altitude, long-endurance drones instead of bare foxtrots. Clancy's Dance of the Vampires may well come to fruition yet, but instead of backfires armed with AS-4 Kitchens, the USN may be facing H-6s with YJ-12s. When it comes to current generation anti-ship cruise missiles, one of the most perplexing conundrums is why there is such comparatively little development in the West compared to the Eastern Bloc. To this day, Western air forces and navies are primarily armed with the same weapons they were in the 1980s, the Harpoon and Exocet. Although they have been upgraded over time, the West still relies exclusively on active radar-guided, subsonic, sea-skimming missiles. Yes, one could certainly argue that these systems were largely equivalent to high-altitude supersonic missiles, such as the Kitchen and Kingfish, but for decades now, Eastern anti-ship missiles have combined a supersonic velocity with a low-altitude terminal approach. Soviet, Russian, Chinese, and even Indian systems are capable of flying almost as low as Harpoon or Exocet, but going 2 to 3 times faster whilst doing so, dramatically improving their terminal lethality. Given the vast military-industrial complex and research and development based in the collective West, and the vast military budgets that fuel them, why hasn't Europe, Japan, or the United States followed suit? Why isn't there a Western equivalent to the Shipwreck, BrahMos, or YJ-18? This is probably the most commonly asked question when it comes to contemporary naval warfare, and there are a few reasons why more lethal ASCMs have not been prioritized in Western navies. The first thing to realize is this is not fundamentally an offense-offense contest. It's the offense versus the defense that really matters. Western navies have, for 40 years now, dominated surface air warfare capabilities. The Aegis-equipped vessels in particular deploy an anti-ship missile defense capability that is truly formidable. Their combination of combat system, sensors, networking, supporting assets, countermeasures, and layered missile and gun defenses make them a truly formidable opponent for any anti-ship cruise missile. Even the less heavily armed European vessels, such as the Type 45, deploy world-class air warfare capabilities, especially in terms of their sensors. Basically, you need more capable anti-ship cruise missiles if you are going to have any hope of effectively engaging something as formidable as a carrier strike group. From the other perspective, over the same 30-year period from the fall of the Soviet Union, the anti-ship missile defenses Western navies have had to contend with have simply been far less formidable. As can be seen in the example of the Moskva, the vast majority of the Russian surface fleet has seen limited refits and upgrades, and therefore still largely deploys the same defensive complex they were built with. The primary air warfare destroyers and cruisers Western navies were likely to face, such as the Sovereign and Slava classes, had not meaningfully moved on from the 1980s. Although they certainly field capable area air defense missiles, such as the navalized Buk and S-300 variants, and close-in weapon systems, their largely analog combat systems and sensors are still key weaknesses. As, throughout the 1990s and 2000s, other regional powers like China and India still relied primarily upon Soviet equipment, this level of air warfare threat was global. In essence, the Harpoon and Exocet were still more than capable of engaging these kinds of threats when employed correctly, especially when the concept of saturation is kept in mind, and thus there simply was no need to develop a supersonic anti-ship cruise missile. Generally speaking, weapons are developed in order to achieve specific tactical effects, and if you can effectively employ a Harpoon, then the fact that your competitors have developed a Mach 3 capable sea skimmer is fundamentally irrelevant. This all began to change in the 2000s and 2010s. China has embarked on one of the greatest shipbuilding programs in modern history. It is comparable to the rapid development of the Kaiserreich's high seas fleet in the early 20th century, putting dozens of new hulls in the water over this period. As part of this vast naval modernization and expansion, the PLA has fielded a number of new, modern destroyer and cruiser classes that possess a far more capable air defense capability. The Type 52 class destroyer, as an example, deploys a highly capable Type 346 S-band AESA air search radar, which combines medium to long range with high resolution and extremely rapid scan rates. When engaging sea skimmers, the Type 346 is a significant improvement over the late generation Soviet systems used on the Sovereign and Slava, such as the top plate and top steer mechanically scanned arrays. This is combined with a layered defensive complex built on the long-range HHQ-9 surface-to-air missile, a modernized S-300 variant, the HQ-10 point defense missile, which is comparable to the rolling airframe missile, and a 30mm close-in weapon system. Although the Type 52D and Type 55 classes still lag behind their Aegis competitors in areas such as networking, over-the-horizon engagement capability, long-range fires, and combat system, they are a very significant upgrade in comparison to their Soviet predecessors. Given the pace of Chinese naval shipbuilding and the investment in new technology more generally, we should only expect PLA and anti-ship cruise missile defenses to improve over the coming decades. As Chinese defenses continue to get better, the probability of a kill for any one Harpoon missile shot will decline, increasing the number required to both have a high likelihood of getting a hit and the level required to achieve saturation. Thus, with this increase in the defensive challenge, a new generation of Western anti-ship cruise missiles has belatedly been developed. But these new Western systems are not supersonic. If we remember the earlier discussion of how naval anti-ship missile defenses work, missile systems can increase their chances of survival, and thus achieving a kill on the target, primarily by limiting the amount of chances the warship has to defeat the missile. Current generation Eastern Bloc missiles do this by combining a low altitude with a supersonic dash, screaming over the radar horizon at Mach 3, giving line of sight defenses a mere 30 seconds to react. But there is more than one way to skin a cat. The next generation of anti-ship cruise missiles aim to apply the same OODA-loop pressure on naval defenses as supersonic missiles by using stealth as opposed to speed. The fundamental design philosophy behind these weapons is, if you can delay detection of the incoming missile to as late a time as possible, ideally until it is well over the radar horizon, you will achieve precisely the same effects as a supersonic missile, despite these weapons only traveling at 600 knots. This approach has several advantages over supersonic missiles. The first is the vulnerability of supersonic systems to over-the-horizon missile shots. Low-level supersonic systems inherently have large signatures, both in the infrared and electromagnetic spectrums. As can be seen in weapons such as the Shipwreck, Onyx, and BrahMos, the requirement to travel at high supersonic speed with air-breathing engines imposes significant aerodynamic design limitations, hindering the use of shaping to reduce the missile's RCS. The punishing environment of supersonic low-altitude flight also puts extreme heat stress on the surface materials, posing significant challenges in the use of radar-absorbent materials. Going fast generally means a large engine and large fuel supply, which makes for a large missile. Even the relatively small BrahMos is massive in comparison to the Harpoon. It's more than twice as long. All this means these supersonic missiles will have a far larger radar cross-section than even a non-stealthy Harpoon or Exocet. This problem is multiplied in terms of infrared signature. Going fast in the lower atmosphere requires a very powerful engine, such as a solid rocket or ramjet, which give off enormous amounts of infrared energy. Plus, sea level flight in excess of Mach 2 causes very significant skin heating. These effects give these weapons a massive infrared signature. Even at long range, to an F-35's distributed aperture system, they will stand out like beacons in the night. With Aegis-equipped vessels now moving almost entirely to active homing surface-to-air missiles, including the SM-6, SM-2 Block 3C, and ESSM Block 2, all of which will be able to engage low-altitude targets over the radar horizon, the range at which these missiles can be engaged has vastly increased. This extended detection and engagement range effectively buys the defenses time, allowing more chances at interception and balancing the increased speed of these weapons. The second major advantage is space and weight. Supersonic missiles tend to be large. The Kitchen, Kingfish, Shipwreck, Onyx, BrahMos, and YJ-18 are all comparatively large weapons, at least 8 meters in length. The Shipwreck weighs 7 tons. This complicates delivery systems significantly, meaning that on surface ships and submarines, these weapons will take up more space. Western subsonic anti-ship cruise missiles are so light and small that they can simply be placed on the deck where there is some spare room. This means more weight and buoyancy for other systems. But where this really matters is in the air. The massive Tu-22 blinder bomber could only carry a single KH-22. The legendary Backfire could carry 3, which would compromise its range significantly. The much smaller F-111 was capable of employing 4 Harpoons. We see this in current generation systems. An Su-30 MKI is limited to a single 2.5 ton or 5,500 pound BrahMos per sortie, whereas the F-35A can carry 6 Joint Strike missiles over a comparable range. Anti-ship cruise missile employment is fundamentally a numbers game. It's all about achieving sufficient mass to overcome your enemy's defenses, and being able to employ up to 6 times more missiles per strike package is a very significant advantage. There are 2 primary next-generation Western anti-ship cruise missiles, the 21st century's Harpoon and Exocet, Lockheed Martin's Long-Range Anti-Ship Missile, or LRASM, and Kongsberg's Naval Strike Missile, the air-launched version of which is called the Joint Strike Missile. Although very different weapons with different design heritages, the NSM and LRASM follow the same fundamental design philosophy and achieve improved terminal lethality in the same way. Both rely on stealth, rather than speed, to apply OODA loop and command and control pressure and to avoid interception. They achieve this via 2 methods: passive sensors and signature reduction. Having a low RCS airframe and low infrared signature is not all that helpful if you are using an active radar seeker, as the electronic intelligence systems on board your target will detect the radar emissions emanating from the missile as soon as it comes over the radar horizon. Thus, both weapons rely upon passive electronic surveillance and off-board sensor information, provided via data link, for long-range target acquisition, and an imaging infrared seeker for terminal target prosecution. Neither missile emits any significant electromagnetic energy. Both combine a very small frontal radar cross-section with a small and efficient turbojet engine, limiting their visibility to both air search radars and infrared search and track systems. Both have a maximum speed in the high subsonic range, and both are very low sea skimmers with a minimum altitude as low as 1 meter. By keeping the maximum speed subsonic, both weapons are comparable in size to a Harpoon or Exocet. In essence, the AGM-158C LRASM is an anti-ship variant of the highly successful Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile, which has been the United States' premier air-launched standoff cruise missile for over a decade. The baseline JASSM is also used by Finland, Poland, and Australia. The JASSM is already a stealthy cruise missile. From its inception, it was designed to be able to penetrate integrated air defense systems with high-end surface-to-air missiles, such as the S-400 and Tor. In order to increase its survivability, extensive effort was given to keeping the weapon's signature as small as possible, especially its frontal RCS. This is achieved both via the shaping of the weapon and the use of radar-absorbing materials. The weapon already has an imaging infrared seeker to aid in precision targeting. The LRASM is a maritime strike variant of the 500 nautical mile ranged JASSM-ER. However, the inclusion of a new seeker and its dedicated electronics package has reduced internal fuel volume somewhat. Lockheed Martin claims the weapon has a range in excess of 200 nautical miles, but something between 300 and 400 seems quite likely. Intended for both air and surface launch, the LRASM weighs a svelte 1,100 kilograms and is some 4 meters long, about the same size as a Harpoon. Its air-launched variant is currently operational, and a surface-launched LRASM is under development. It delivers a 1,000-pound broach warhead that is designed to penetrate hardened structures, allowing it to reach deep into the vitals of an enemy warship, including engines, fuel bunkers, and magazines. The weapon is currently operational with the USAF and USN, and a contract for 200 weapons has been signed for the Royal Australian Air Force. One of the most interesting things about the LRASM is how smart the weapon is. Using a long-range, subsonic anti-ship cruise missile poses some unique challenges, the greatest of which is area of uncertainty mitigation. As discussed previously, ships move, often at up to 30 knots. That means as soon as you lose contact, every second the area of uncertainty grows. When you have a missile like the LRASM, which may cruise at 400 knots, even if you know exactly where the enemy vessel was when you launched the weapon, it will be an hour before it gets there. This is a more challenging issue for sea-skimming missiles which use infrared seekers for terminal prosecution because their sensor footprint is small. If the enemy warship has moved some 30 nautical miles since you launched, chances are, without a position update, the weapon won't acquire the target and you'll miss. The easiest solution to this problem is simply to keep an eye on the target task force with something like a drone and update the missile via satellite data link, which is certainly something you can do with the LRASM. However, what if you lack this element in the kill chain? What if you are in a highly contested battle space and you simply can't provide that kind of persistent targeting data, or you want to use a fleeting satellite contact to provide the firing solution alone? Well, the LRASM is designed to provide mid-course updates all by itself. The missile is guided by advanced AI software that can make complex tactical decisions, including reducing the area of uncertainty simply by relying on its own sensors. As the missile approaches the wider target area at high altitude, it relies on its electronic intelligence suite to build a passive electromagnetic picture of the battle space, logging and tracking hostile emissions such as radar signals and data links. By doing this, it can both locate and classify target warships via their electromagnetic signature, identifying what radars are operational, for example, and all at very long range. If multiple missiles are in the area, they can share this information by low probability of intercept data link, forming a local network. With this updated picture now available, the LRASM identifies the most valuable targets, such as an aircraft carrier, and plots its own course. The weapon is smart enough to identify threats, such as radar pickets or escorting air warfare destroyers, and navigate around them, maintaining a large enough distance to minimize the possibility of detection. Once the weapon approaches the selected target, it drops to wavetop level, using a radar altimeter to maintain an altitude of 1 to 2 meters and accelerates to 600 knots. As the target comes into view, the seeker visually identifies the class of warship, aiming for vulnerable points such as the bridge or magazines. If there are multiple missiles connected in a local network, they can conduct a coordinated strike, simultaneously attacking the same target from different directions. The LRASM can do all of this without a single update from the launch platform or centralized command and control. It literally does it all on its own. We certainly have come a long way from the Harpoon simply following preset waypoints until it turns its radar on. We don't know exactly how stealthy the LRASM is, but suffice to say it's quite likely that it will be detected within the radar horizon, greatly compressing reaction time, and the lack of a radar seeker increases the chances that an enemy warship will be caught with its pants down and not at a high state of readiness. The NSM and JSM deploy many of the same capabilities. The currently fielded naval strike missile has been operational since 2012 with the Norwegian, Polish, and American militaries, and has been selected for use by the Royal Australian Navy, Royal Canadian Navy, Spanish Navy, Royal Malaysian Navy, and Romanian Navy. The subsonic NSM provides much of the tactical lethality of the LRASM. It also uses an imaging infrared seeker, maintaining a minimal electromagnetic profile, which is capable of visually classifying target vessels. The seeker is equipped with a target database, ensuring that the appropriate and most valuable vessel is struck. It also fields a two-way data link, allowing for mid-course update, mission abort, and target switching. The NSM is much smaller than the LRASM. The entire weapon weighs just 410 kilograms, less than 1,000 pounds. Despite its tiny size, it has a range in excess of 100 nautical miles. For mid-course guidance, the weapon uses a GPS-updated inertial navigation system. After it is launched by a solid rocket booster, the Naval Strike Missile is propelled by a micro-turbo TRI-40 turbojet engine, which has a tiny infrared signature. Although RCS reduction was certainly a priority when designing the missile, one of the main reasons why the weapon is so hard to detect is its tiny size. It is just 48 centimeters in diameter, meaning even without RCS reduction techniques, it's a hard weapon to spot. One of the primary shortcomings of the Naval Strike Missile platform is its relatively small payload, a semi-armor piercing blast fragmentation warhead that weighs just 125 kilos or 250 pounds, a far cry from the LRASM's 1,000 pound Broach warhead. However, as we saw with the loss of Sheffield, which succumbed to a fire that was started by an Exocet that didn't even detonate, even this sized explosion inside a modern warship can do tremendous damage, although certainly multiple hits would be required to do crippling damage to a capital ship. The NSM can be deployed by either ship or coastal battery. The air-launched variant is the Joint Strike Missile, a joint development of the NSM by both Raytheon and Kongsberg. The JSM uses a very similar design to the NSM, although the single overhead air intake has been changed in order to fit 5th generation weapons base. Currently, the JSM lacks the kind of autonomous targeting capability provided by the LRASM. Although there were plans to integrate a similar passive electronic intelligence package, which were being funded by the Australian government, it's unclear whether this is still being pursued, especially given Australia's purchase of the LRASM. Nonetheless, the JSM still uses advanced targeting software. It can autonomously classify targets and aim for vulnerable positions, and conduct swarm attacks with other missiles that are linked via data link. The JSM provides a truly impressive capability given its tiny size. Using a high-altitude launch, high-altitude cruise, and low-altitude attack profile, the missile reportedly has a maximum range in excess of 300 nautical miles, allowing the launch platform to stand off well beyond any conceivable defences. Using its internal and external weapon stations, 6 JSMs can be employed by a single F-35A, allowing a single strike package to generate a formidable mass of fire. A 12-strong squadron attack will be able to fire some 72 missiles at a target from 300 nautical miles, well beyond the range of even most carrier-based fighter defences. Using passive sensors and offboard targeting, the missiles will then conduct an autonomous, massed, coordinated attack, sharing targeting information via data link. Like a swarm of bees, dozens of these tiny, stealthy missiles will scream over the radar horizon just 3 feet above the waves, posing an extreme saturation threat to even the most well-protected task forces. Truly, the JSM exemplifies the adage that sometimes bigger is not better. Anti-ship cruise missiles truly are the artillery of modern naval warfare. Doctrine, tactics, naval design, and force structure are all built around the employment of this one weapon system. More than anything else, the anti-ship cruise missile is the dominant feature of 21st century naval combat. This is likely to remain the case well into this century and probably beyond, despite the emergence of new technologies that are currently stealing the headlines, such as anti-ship ballistic missiles and hypersonics. Both of these are fascinating topics that really go beyond the remit of this discussion, one that is already too long. In fact, both deserve their own specific treatment. As is often the case when breakthrough and potentially disruptive technology is developed, extremely high hopes are being placed on these two new weapons. However, much like the hype that surrounded the invention of the torpedo, which led to many pundits claiming that the weapon had rendered the big gun battleship, indeed the capital ship itself, obsolete, these hopes may well be excessive. Very similar claims are currently being made about these newer technologies, especially hypersonics. But as good historians, we should always keep the long view in mind, remembering that even successful Wunderwaffe rarely live up to the high expectations placed upon them. After all, history shows us just how wrong they were in the early 20th century, and perhaps that should make us cautious in the early 21st. That is not to say that hypersonics and anti-ship ballistic missiles will not change naval warfare. They certainly will, but we should be very skeptical of claims that these weapons have rendered the aircraft carrier obsolete or that they are unstoppable. Arguably, the anti-ship ballistic missile is a niche weapon, and the technological maturity of hypersonic anti-ship missiles is grossly overstated. Indeed, many of these highly touted developments, such as the BrahMos 2, are simply slightly faster anti-ship cruise missiles, and even the Soviets deployed a hypersonic ASCM in the 1980s, the KH-15, NATO's designation AS-16 kickback. Hypersonic systems will certainly not completely replace the conventional anti-ship cruise missile anytime soon. The USN, which is one of the few organizations that have both hypersonic and anti-ship ballistic missile weapon development programs, through missiles like the multi-role SM-6 Block 1B, which will act both as a terminal phase hypersonic and ballistic missile interceptor and as an anti-ship ballistic missile itself, has no plans to retire the humble, subsonic anti-ship cruise missile. New anti-ship versions of the Tomahawk are being developed as I speak. In any case, the employment of hypersonics and the anti-ship ballistic missile still rely upon the same fundamental mechanics as the anti-ship cruise missile. The primacy of the battle network, kill chain, and winning the battle network competition more generally. Saturation and the offense-defense contest will dominate naval warfare throughout the 21st century, just as they did throughout the last half of the 20th. And the anti-ship cruise missile will surely remain the primary arm of navies across the world for decades to come.